I have a secret. Anytime I listen to podcasts, I will pause the podcast and answer the questions as though the interviewer is asking them to me. Or answer what someone else says as though I'm the one they're having a conversation with. I can't believe I'm recording this to publish it. That's so embarrassing. I have a Leo moon, okay? It's not an excuse, but maybe it's an explanation. I don't know. But there are so many podcasts and people who create content and thinkers and speakers that I just respect so much. And it is like, it is a dream to one day be able to talk with them, to interview them, to be interviewed by them would feel like, I don't even know. I would die. That would just be the coolest thing in the world. And I realized that happening within the immediate future is probably not super likely. In the future, who knows? I'm definitely open to it. I'm manifesting it. But in the meantime, I figured, what the hell? I'll just interview myself using some of my favorite episodes from some of my favorite podcasts as a starting point and kind of doing what I just described, hitting pause and answering what I think about what they're talking about. And I think not only does this help me process my own thoughts and feelings and responses by talking them through out loud, it also helps me get more out of these podcasts because I am actively listening and engaging, not just passively letting it play in the background and zoning out, right? Or even not zoning out, but when you have to put your thoughts into words, it makes you get precise in a way that you don't have to be when your thoughts are just still in your head. So I thought that this could be a fun way to share a different avenue for how I think about things, for my approach to things, and would also be a fun way to listen and engage with some of the most inspirational creators in my life. Of course, I want to preface by saying anyone that I feature during the series, please go watch the original video, go support them and all that they do. These are all people that I respect so deeply and have impacted the way I view the world around me and myself. So also thank you to all of these creators for the work that you do. If you happen to be seeing this, that would be really freaking cool. For the first episode, I have chosen to go back to Rhett and Link's Spiritual Deconstructions. I am going to start with Rhett's because it was the first one that was put out there, but next I am going to do Link's. If you're unfamiliar with their work, 1, how dare you? 2, how? But they are the forces behind Mythical and behind Good Mythical Morning. That's probably what you would know them from. Their podcast, Ear Biscuits, has been a really profound place for change in, I would say, the internet community over the last few years, especially through these episodes that they released about their spiritual deconstruction. And I have watched Rhett and Link since Good Mythical Morning was Good Morning Chia Lincoln. I am an OG Mythical beast. I have been watching them since I was 11 years old, I want to say. Longer than I've been going to therapy, which is crazy. And I literally grew up with them. And when I was watching them was when I was going through my own spiritual deconstruction and reconstruction. And I will never forget the first time I listened to these episodes, and I was just floored by not only their ability to think about things so deeply and present them in a way that was so accessible, but the radical vulnerability that they had. These episodes of Ear Biscuits changed the trajectory of how I think of content and of the type of content and art that I wanted to create. And I can't imagine a better place to start a series like this than right here. So for this episode, I'm going to be listening and responding to Rhett's Spiritual Deconstruction. Before I hit play, also, if for whatever reason Rhett and Link do end up finding these episodes, thank you for being a soft place for me to land for quite literally my entire life since I was aware of YouTube. And inspiring the way I think about comedy and art and the intersection between purpose and meaning and depth and levity and joy and community. Okay, I think that's all I want to say before hitting play. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Ear Biscuits. I'm Link.
And I'm nervous.
Yeah, man, this has been a long time coming.
Actually, my name is Rhett, but I am nervous. Just a
quick recap. We've been
this week. You got a catchphrase.
I'm off my game, man.
I'm gonna be off my game all day today.
This week at the
round table of dim lighting, I am telling my story of how I kind of got to where I am in terms of my.
Okay, I just have to say, I know that nothing even like substantive has been added yet, but as someone who remembers watching these episodes when they dropped and is now since, of course, listened to their yearly updates and all of that good stuff, and it just makes me, this is just such a weird, like, full circle moment for me, and seeing how nervous they are and also where they are now and how not necessarily comfortable they've gotten talking about these topics, but how honest I feel like the things they create now are. Like Good Mythical Morning feels more honest. Wonderhole is, to me, it's my favorite thing that Rhett and Link have ever done. I think Wonderhole is a masterclass in creativity, period. To look back on this, I think it's 5-6 years ago, and just see like the nervous energy that they have. I hesitate to say makes me proud because they don't know me and it feels a little weirdly condescending, but it makes me really happy for them that, I mean, just the act of bravery that this took and that they're living. I mean, I guess in my weird parasocial relationship, I don't know how honest they're being now, right? But it feels really authentic. And I just think that's really cool.
Belief and why I don't believe what I used to believe. And of course, this is all in a larger series that we're doing. The last two podcasts we called The Lost Years, where we covered, all those stories, filling in the gaps of how we got from being engineers to being YouTubers, and the path that we took, which was a little atypical and involved being missionaries for a while.
Yeah, if you haven't listened to those previous two podcasts, I recommend listening to those first. But this one and the next one are going to be totally different than the previous two because they're going to be very personal in nature, very singular in nature. This is your episode, and then next week will be my episode.
I'm just now realizing I have Italian subtitles on. So I'm going to turn those off. I live in Italy and I'm learning Italian, so I usually put Italian subtitles on or listen in Italian and put English subtitles on. So apologies for that.
It'll just come up every month or every couple of months for many years. It's just, when are we gonna talk about like the spiritual aspect of our lives and our faith journey, I guess you would call it. Knowing that we always would. So
yeah, okay. So before we get into that, I have a couple of things to acknowledge. First of all, for those of you watching the podcast, yes, I do have my hair pulled back into some sort of configuration. I don't know the technical name for this, and I apologize for it if you are the kind of person like me who judges men who do this with their hair.
I would call it a sad ponytail.
Yeah.
I think, when you're, it just seems like it's such an interesting
Choice?
The timing's interesting because this is such a momentous.
There's two very specific reasons why I'm doing it
This is a momentous
today.
episode for you.
Yeah, I'm doing it for two reasons, Link. Reason number one is my hair has gotten to the point where I can do this. And then I started realizing why people do this. Because this podcast, I got notes. As you can see, I've got my iPad out. I'm going to be going through notes. I mean, I don't know where this is going to go, and I don't want to be distracted by my big old bouffant falling down in my face. And
Bouffant. Great word. But as someone with longer hair, when you mean business, you have to have a ponytail, period. That's how that works. It's how it works.
Having to move it all around. So it's tight, it's in place, and I'm not going to think about it. Now, you might think about it, but just stop thinking about it. Okay?
I wasn't even going to mention it.
Thanks. The other thing I want to say real quick is that yesterday, Link and I were on the road pitching a project that we're hoping will become something. And on the way back now Link has been driving.
Why don't you want to say what the project is?
Well, yeah, we're trying to turn The Lost Causes of Bleak Creek into a TV show. So hopefully somebody will agree to that. But we're coming back from a meeting, and Link has been driving because he's got the new fancy electric Audi. And so he drives everywhere. Eventually, I'll get a fancy car, and then I'll drive too. But right now, we're just enjoying Link's new car. So he's been driving around town. And then yesterday, on the way back from the other side of town, from the west side, we're at a light, and Link just kind of takes off when it turns green. And then he turns to me and says, I almost hit that pedestrian. Now, first of all, you got to understand.
Yeah, because you and Stevie didn't see that I almost hit a pedestrian.
Because I'm not driving. Because I don't have to pay attention to the pedestrians.
When you turn
maybe
right
I
on.
do.
Yeah.
And you don't have to explain it.
Okay.
You almost always hit pedestrians. Okay?
I don't know why you're talking about this, but go ahead.
With Link driving,
Because
maybe you do.
Last night, I got a message on Instagram.
What?
I feel like if you have taken knives and scissors and any sharp objects away from someone, you should probably also take away deathly motor vehicles and operating machinery. I feel like that would fall under the same umbrella, but I don't know, just my 2 cents.
Just seen y'all in the Audi. You almost hit me. LOL. Love the show.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That's
Almost
so
hit
funny.
a fan?
Yeah. Yeah. You
Almost killed a mythical beast?
Almost killed a mythical beast.
Oh, man. Oh, my gosh.
If Rhett or Link hit me with a
So
car,
anyway,
I'd
Oh, my
say
gosh.
thank you.
He's okay.
I need to process
He's a little shaken up. But
Yeah, I know.
But not
I'm
enough to send me a
I
message.
wouldn't say a little. I'm a lot shaken up.
Link, you do this regularly, man. Okay. Back to the task at hand.
Oh, man. This is when the spiritual stuff really matters, man.
Right,
When
right,
we're talking about
exactly.
life and death.
Mhm, exactly. Okay. My goal today, first of all, I want to let you know, just like Link said, today's going to be different. I'm going to be doing most of the talking. Next week, Link will be doing most of the talking. And when I say most, I mean, like, I've got these detailed notes that I've literally been, like, making for months at this point in preparation for telling this story. And so I just don't want to get things wrong. I want to be able to move through this. It gets very detailed. I honestly don't know how anyone who doesn't come from a similar background.
I kind of think you have to do that with a story like this. At least I would have to. And it's funny because with Rhett and Link being like the kind of 2 archetypes of their best friendship, it's so funny because my dad is so Link coded and my mom is so Rhett coded that I notice the behaviors I have like both of them because they're kind of like both of my parents. And so obviously you have behaviors from both of your parents, but this is absolutely the way I would go about having this conversation. I did the very first episode of Making Meaning, my podcast, is just me kind of talking about why I'm doing this. And it talks about my spiritual journey a little bit, but I didn't make extremely extensive notes because I knew I didn't want it to be like a 3-hour long podcast just talking about my spiritual experience. But if I was going to do that, I would totally like do it in this format too.
background is going to be interested in what I'm about to say, because it kind of gets into the nitty gritty of, Christian belief and Christian doubt about those things. And my particular, what we call a deconstruction story of how I no longer consider myself an evangelical Christian. It's very detailed because the things that were happening in my mind and my heart is sort of a particular thread that you may or may not relate to, but it is my story and I'm going to tell it. Like Link said, I'm nervous. I'm anxious about this. I mean, the last two podcasts, obviously, we were nervous about talking about those years and how people might perceive that, because people come from so many different backgrounds. They have so many different points of view when it comes to this issue. Either you're in it, you were in it, and you're out of it. You have no way of relating to it. And that particular perspective that you bring to, listening to our stories, as I've seen in these Twitter comments that people have been making, people sometimes they just don't know what to think about it,
Yeah.
But the thing that I am particularly with telling my story, the thing that I just want to be very clear about is that I am not here to judge where you're at currently, right? So when you tell a story and you're like, I used to believe this and now I no longer believe that, and here's why. If you still believe that, then you may think there's implicit judgment in what you think. And I want to say that is not my intention. And I'm just trying to be as honest about my own situation as possible.
I'll say, to his point earlier, I remember when all four of this kind of series dropped, it blew up the internet. And maybe it was just because I was following a lot of accounts that had to do with Rhett and Link, because I was a fan, but it was a big deal. And a lot of the comments weren't exclusively positive. And I remember, I think that's part of why I have such respect for this, is the way they've just handled it with such tact and dignity and self-respect. But on this judgment piece that Rhett just said, I think that it's really, really hard to not feel judged when someone is like, well, I used to think what you think and now I think something different. But even if there is some judgment in that, not necessarily in the negative connotation of I am judging you to be bad, but in the I've used my judgment to judge that your belief is wrong. Well, you are disagreeing with that person. And so it's going to feel bad if you like someone and they disagree with you, especially about something as big as this. I think the important distinction here is that Rhett is a public figure and the audience is an audience. And so he can't judge you personally because he doesn't know you personally, but the audience, through this parasocial relationship, is having that feeling of like, oh my gosh, my internet uncle is judging me, right? So I think that gets complicated in this forum, but also breaking this concept down into real life. I actually had a conversation just like this a few weeks ago, and it was really hard. That was, I remember believing what you believe, and I don't believe that anymore. And because of that, our relationship is not working. We're butting heads. And the person that I was talking to was like, well, so you think I'm wrong? And I was like, I do. I've grown past that understanding. For me, that's growth. I don't criticize you and your journey or your belief that that's the right thing to do, but you can see how this makes our relationship difficult, because I do think that you still have growth to move into. And it was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had, because I did feel like I was passing judgment. And I think in a way I probably was and am. And we've both taken space from this friendship now because of this misunderstanding, which I think is healthiest for both of us. But that was a really hard moment for me in recognizing that, like, that doesn't make me mean. And ignoring that was not being a good friend to that person. So I think there's layers to this judgment piece, clearly. But
possible and approach this with as much humility as possible. So that. It is going to get detailed, and I really try to condense it down. But this is like a years long process. I'm going back basically 20 years and kind of telling a lot of different things that happen. But this is not going to be as detailed as some of you might want it to be, and it's going to be more detailed than some of you want it to be. Okay, so,
and I'm here to support you.
Well, thank you, Link. You want to hold my hand?
If you need that, sure. I'm also going to take notes because I don't want to interrupt you. If there's something I'm thinking, that I'll just jot it down. And
if
I love them. It's so beautiful. And I think even over the last 5 years since this episode has come out, we've continued to see their friendship evolve in a really beautiful way. Again, just makes me happy for them, as odd as that may sound.
I want you to hold my hand at any point, I will just extend it. Okay?
Yeah, just do that. I'll know that's what that means.
First of all, even though we kind of covered this in one of the previous podcasts, what it meant to me to be a Christian. Now, I believed that Jesus was the Son of God, that a personal relationship with him was the only way to be saved, i.e., the only way to go to heaven when you die. And this belief...
I think this is such an important point, and I'm really glad that Rhett starts here, because as I grew up in Texas, in Southern Baptist Christianity, my parents were not super devout. It was more, well, we come from Christian families, and religion was never really a big part of their lives, but you should go to church. And on top of that, it was also like a framework to raise kids with, that when you have a really big question, like where do babies come from your 6-year-old, it makes it a lot easier to say God. And it gives you a framework for morals, ethics, values that 9 times out of 10, I think are helpful to have a religion based in loving one another, loving your neighbor as yourself, living like Jesus would. I think those are all really beautiful principles. Of course, there are other Christian values that are deeply harmful, but I think for me, that is the main distinction between with why I don't call myself a Christian anymore, is because that is the definition of Christianity. It's not just believing that you should love God and love each other. If it was, I'd be a Christian. It is believing that Jesus was the only begotten Son of God that was sent to die on a cross for our sins, and only through a personal relationship with him can you have everlasting life. And that I don't believe. And I think that this is where some gray area comes in right from the beginning with Christianity too. We know Jesus was a historic figure who actually existed and was real. Of course, we don't have any actual accounts of him rising from the dead. Of course, I think it's John's gospel that claims he does, that has the only post-resurrection accounts, which was written the farthest away from the time that Jesus actually was crucified. So, of course, the fantastical nature kind of snowballs. And you get into this debate between literal readings of the Bible versus metaphorical, and it gets really complicated. But I think it is important to start here when you're talking about Christianity defined everything for me. This was my worldview. It gave me purpose and meaning. And I lived with this knowledge of this spiritual reality, right? There's a spiritual reality that is constantly around us, kind of permeating every decision, every relationship, every conversation. And I want to emphasize how big of a deal it was to me. It was a relationship. And I want to say that because I've noticed that when I tell my story, often people kind of conclude that I was never a true Christian, right? And I'm addressing this up front for a couple of reasons. First of all, I understand why people do this, because this is what I did
for many years when I had friends who said, I don't really believe that anymore. And I would be like, well, you must have never believed it. You must have never really had a real relationship with Jesus, because according to my particular theology at the time, which was eternal security, which is once you're God's child, you're always God's child, and you can't get away. Once you have faith, you might fall away for a little bit, but you're always going to come back, and you're sealed, you're delivered, you're going to be saved. And
that's the message.
That's a difficult thing for me now, because I got to be honest, it kind of feels very dismissive, right? And I don't think it really accounts for what actually the reality was and is. And so the only thing I'm going to ask is that you just don't reduce me to a theological footnote as you're listening to this story. Because as far as I'm concerned, Jesus was as real to me as he possibly could be without physically manifesting himself in my presence.
I think that this is a really, really important note that Rhett brings up here at the beginning, because not only does everyone deserve the time and respect of a generous audience when they are telling their story, especially, but baked into this statement is a respect for people who still hold the belief that he no longer does. This kind of request for Christians or religious people to lend him a generous ear inherently is respecting them. And I think that there is something really beautiful in that is also, maybe you can learn something that will deepen your faith, help you be curious about purpose, meaning, these things that he mentioned, but also bring us all together in our shared humanity.
It was a relationship. We were in conversation. So with that kind of setting the stage, I'm going to get into the story, kind of starting back with my college years. But first,
I love that Link's already taking notes.
Because that seems like the most appropriate thing to do.
Well, because we always do ad breaks.
I mean, it's
Go to mythical.com.
Everything doesn't last forever. So
I put on my Noah Khan sweatshirt today, but my Be Your Mythical Best is in the jacket. Go get yourself some Mythical merch.
it may not be these mugs, but it's stuff that you got to scoop up when they're at mythical.com. Support your boys.
Support your boys.
So even in the midst of a very vibrant Christian faith, I would have doubts. I hear a little something about how the Bible came together, how the 27 books of the New Testament were kind of put together and the way that, the canon came together. And I would be like, this doesn't seem as clean as maybe I thought that it might have been. I would think a little bit about the resurrection of Jesus, and I'd be like, that's a tough thing. It's a tough thing, but that's the whole point. It's tough. I have faith. And what I would typically do is I would have these sessions where I would sort of rederive my faith, but also I would do what I think a lot of Christians do, is that when you have a doubt about something, you go and you read a Christian expert. We call it apologetics in Christianity, somebody who can basically defend the faith. These are smart people who can they can read Hebrew and Greek, and they've been to seminary, they've written books, and they spend their life studying this stuff. And they put out a lot of material that, and they're smarter than me, and they are more knowledgeable than me. So what I would do is I would just go and I would find somebody who was smarter than me, and they would be like, oh, no, it's very reasonable to believe this. There's very good reason to believe this. And that would kind of plaster over my doubt in that particular area for a while.
What?
I think that's such a beautiful analogy for doubt within religion, is that it's kind of plastered over. You can't fully get rid of it, right? There's a stifling of the mental exercise. And I do think that there is a certain sense of betraying the self that has to take place when that happens too, that is even what Rhett just said, oh, these people are smarter than me, they understand it, they're convincing of all of this, and it's okay, I can believe it because I'm dumb, I don't get it, but these people do, they've studied it. to a certain extent, like, yes, it's important for us to learn from people smarter than us. I mean, I'm listening to people that are smarter than me right now. But for your life view, for your world view, for your framework for how you live, it's got to make sense to you. And if there is any loose thread, even if it unravels the whole sweater, you got to pull at it. You have to pull at it. Because why do you want to wear a sweater that can come apart so easily? Yeah, I don't know, but I suppose any sweater can be unraveled if you tug at it hard enough, and part of faith is just trusting that it will stay together, trusting that it is still a good sweater. More on that as we go.
What time frame are you referring to? Are you talking about adulthood, or are you talking about as a kid?
This probably started in high school, was happening a lot in college, and then it's happened ever since.
Mm-hmm.
But in college, I met some people who were really interested in the book of Genesis and were specifically what you call a young earth creationist. So this is someone who believes that the book of Genesis is literal history, and that the implication from that is that the world is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. That's when this whole thing
This
began.
is real, and it's scary.
Along with that comes the idea that Noah's flood, like Noah and the ark, that's a true story. And the entire world was flooded, like, a few thousand years ago. All the animals were on a boat. And then every single layer of sediment that you see with all the fossils and everything in it is a result of that flood. And this isn't a small group of people. There's a large group of people in evangelical Christianity who believe this, still believe this. I never thought about this. My parents didn't really care much about these particular issues, right? It wasn't something that we grew up being taught.
It wasn't taught in our youth group. A lot was being taught.
Yeah.
On multiple times a week as we were involved, but we didn't tackle this issue.
But I was like, I haven't really thought about this. Let me look into this. And again, I'm going to do this multiple times in the story today. I'm going to tell you that I looked into something, and then I'm not going to give you an exhaustive or extensive. There's a couple places I'm going to go into that, but here's not one of them because I just don't have time. But long story short, when I looked into this, I basically learned that no matter what scientific discipline you start from, the evidence points overwhelmingly to a world that is very old, billions of years old, to be specific. And basically, the world doesn't really make sense unless it's ancient. I mean, there's so many things about the world that don't make sense. Now, just a couple of helpful books that were helpful for me. There's lots of places you can see all this stuff, but these are both from a Christian perspective. First one was Creation and Time by Hugh Ross, which kind of takes a little bit more look at the astronomical aspect of this. And then another one that gets more into geology is The Bible, Rocks, and Time, which is an incredible resource that if you're interested in this, I suggest that you read. But basically, this was learning that there was all this evidence that kind of pointed pretty clearly to the earth being old, and then realizing that there was a really large contingent of Christians who just denied that and didn't believe that. It was alarming. It was alarming for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, maintaining that young earth view, it requires sort of dismissing or reinterpreting a lot of evidence that has been gathered, right? And you got this big umbrella of Christianity, and the whole idea is that we've got the truth. The whole point is we have the ultimate truth, right? As Christians, God has revealed the ultimate truth to us. This is what I believed. But yet within that camp, there are these two wildly different perspectives on basically the entire natural world. Mm-hmm. And I was like, something about this is alarming because this isn't as clean as I thought it was.
I just love the way he orders his narrative, because I do think the first layers of doubt that you start to feel aren't necessarily from some innate, oh, this doesn't feel right, but it is from seeing contradictions. And within the church, there are a lot of contradictions. The word alarming, I think, is really important because it's this is my worldview. how could there be two camps? What is capital T truth? I've been told that there's this capital T truth. And I think the other thing about this that is so alarming is that it is dismissive of science and the things that we know to be true about the natural world. I don't believe that religion and science have to contradict each other. I actually think oftentimes spirituality and science line up in a lot of really beautiful ways. Arthur C. Clarke has a quote, I believe it's his third rule of physics, something. I'll link it in the description. But it is, any sufficient science will be indistinguishable from magic. And I love that. I think that that is so true, that there are things that we have come to be able to explain through the language of science or physics or language, psychology, neuroscience, right? But back in the day, when you don't have access to those insights, it is just magic, right? Like, witches casting spells would be burned at the stake. Now, someone says an affirmation in their mirror and it makes them feel better. Well, that's not a spell. That's not witchcraft. That's psychology. That's neuroscience. We know why it works. There is this weird lining up of science and spirituality that I think is actually the key to a lot of how I've developed my belief, but a lot of how we can find similarities across difference. But flat out denying science, I don't think that's a wise stance for the church to take. And I think the other subsection that we see start to happen within the Christian church is also literal interpretation of the Bible versus metaphorical or abstract interpretation of the Bible.
So I was unsettled, but I was still a Christian. I mean, the core of my Christian belief was still very much intact. Still believe that the Bible was completely true. And I believe that there was a pretty easy way to reconcile this old earth view, they call it, with a literal interpretation of Genesis and the Bible. I still knew that evolution wasn't true. I knew evolution hadn't happened, right?
Duh.
Because what I knew is that Adam and Eve had to be real. Adam and Eve had to be real because so much comes from them being real. That's the fall that's where the fall happens. And the fall is the reason that we have original sin. And original sin is why we need a savior. It was like, you can't get rid of that story. Plus, Genesis presents all this stuff straight from Adam and Eve, and you go through all the generations. Even the Gospel of Luke, the genealogy of Jesus, features Adam. So if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, like where do you start believing it, right? So I knew I couldn't let go of that.
I do think that that's a really good point, that the whole crux of Christianity, even though it seems like it falls at the feet of the crucifixion, actually falls at original sin, because there would be no need for the crucifixion if there wasn't inherent sin in the human being. And I think even within that, we can begin to see the logical fallacies that take place, right? When an all-knowing, all-loving, all-benevolent God creates a world, why would he create beings that he knows are going to be imperfect, that he knows are going to sin? If he's omniscient and omnipresent, it's difficult. And I think out of this is actually where we see a Gnostic tradition rise up. There was a really, really big sect that was called Gnostic Christianity that actually believed that the body was all sinful, all sin was in the human body, and our true selves, our true souls are all immaterial, non-physical, and that is where you can kind of explain some of this idea of original sin, and that's actually linked to the body and not the soul, and this spiritual idea of the afterlife. You can kind of see how you would get there naturally through a logical conclusion. But that tradition was kind of buried. The Gnostic tradition also says that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament, that the God of the Old Testament is an evil creator called a demiurge. And there's a really, really wonderful video from Esoterica here on YouTube about the demiurge. I'll link it down below. A demiurge is an evil creator, an omniscient God, but not just not benevolent, but bad, that creates Adam and Eve to sin, and that when Jesus comes, this replaces the all bad God with an all good, all benevolent God. And that's the God that we should be worshiping. As the canon for the Bible is developed, this idea is kind of pushed to the side. And now Gnostic Christianity is considered fringe and kind of new agey, even though it's old agey. So within all of this, I think the thing that's really difficult is that it's hard to separate a literal translation of the Bible from the requirements for being a Christian. When you get into a metaphoric translation of the Bible, it does make the question of the omnigod and the necessity of a theodicy more and more important. Because why would an all-new, all-good, all benevolent God create a sinful world?
There was definitely there's a pervading thought that I had that evolution is just something you stay away from. And if you don't want to get into it, don't get into it. Just it's a problem. So don't
look too closely.
Right. So don't worry about it.
And not even beyond that, I thought evolution just didn't make sense on its face. It seemed completely illogical. In fact, it seemed desperate.
If you did start to think about it.
It seemed like it was so non-intuitive to me at the time that it just felt like a desperate attempt for someone who didn't believe in God to try to explain the wonderful creation that we had. You got to have something. Well, if God didn't do it, you got to come up with some rant. You got to come up with something. Mm-hmm. And evolution was the best thing that they had to offer. And that was it for me. And of course, I had read all the books about evolution not being true. I was into that. In fact, I would sit down and I would argue with people and convince people who believed in evolution that evolution didn't happen. I loved doing that. You know what I'm saying?
I think that's also the problem of being a really smart person with really strongly held convictions and beliefs, is that you can convince other people of a lot based on your belief and your argumentative skills. I remember when I was little, I was a part of a group called Girls of Faith, and it was my elementary school girl gang. We called ourselves the Six Amigos. Problematic, looking back on it. Also, why was it Six Amigos and not Seis Amigos? I'll never know. Problematic either way. But a lot of us in this group had different religions, and so we did service projects together, but as an act of service, as an act of faith, but honoring all of our different religions. And then we would also read from each other's religious texts, which was actually really, really cool. And one of my friends in elementary school, her mom organized this, and it was wonderful. Her family is Baha'i, and another one of my friends was Mormon. And then me and one other girl were Christian. And then there was a Catholic and an atheist out of the six of us. And I remember at one of these meetings talking to my friend who was an atheist, and she had pretty much recently decided to be an atheist, and her parents had just gotten divorced. I was young enough to be still really convicted, and I remember thinking she just doesn't believe because of this hard thing that's happened to her. And when she sees the beauty of Christianity, she'll come back. And I sat there and kind of argued with her for a really long time about why she should be a Christian. And she was like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I remember saying, I know you're sad right now because of your parents. And it really hurt her. And it's actually something I carry a lot of guilt around. Of course, I was a kid and she was a kid, and who knows if she even remembers it. We're not really even in touch anymore. The idea that this religion that was supposed to make me a loving, good person said something so hurtful to someone because of that religion, because I was told you have to proselytize, you have to tell your story. There's pressure with everyone that you meet that you need to tell them the truth. I also remember my friend who was Baha'i. After my first sleepover at her house, learning that she was Baha'i and learning about Baha'i, getting in the car the next day when my mom picked me up and immediately falling into tears. And she's like, "Oh my God, what happened? What's going on?" I said, "Mom, my friend's, she's not a Christian. Is she gonna go to hell?" And I was just sobbing. It's my best friend. This person who was the best person I knew welcomed me. I had just switched schools, and this girl was so nice to me. We clicked right off the bat, nicer to me than anyone else. But she didn't believe Jesus was the one true savior. And my mom said, I keep saying her name, "She is not going to hell, sweetie. It'll be okay." And I'm like, but that's what the Bible says. That's what it says. This sparked this evolution of how I talked to my parents about religion and began to understand a little bit more how they actually viewed Christianity and their relationship to God. But I do think that was one of the first things that planted little tendrils of doubt in my mind was, how can something that is supposed to make me good be hateful to these other people and make me so scared?
It would make people doubt that pretty easily. Mm-hmm. Of course, I had never looked at the evidence revolution. I had read books about it written by people who didn't believe in it. That's what I had done. And I could roll those arguments out with it.
And that's what just about every church leader will give to you when you have doubts.
The best of them.
At least in my experience.
Then in 2006, I read a book called The Language of God by Francis Collins. Now, Francis Collins is currently the head of the National Institutes of Health. He's a geneticist who headed up the Human Genome Project when they mapped the human genome there at the end of the 90s. The subtitle of the book is "A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief." This is the kind of thing that I lived for. I loved it when someone who was a scientific mind, who was respected by the world, would come out and basically do this.
It alleviates the cognitive dissonance.
To show you that your faith was reasonable and smart people believe this. I ate this stuff up. So I got...
Everything that this is talking about is the cognitive dissonance of, there are things that don't make sense, but I'm a smart person and I want to be smart, but I have this really deep set belief that seems like certain things maybe are illogical. And it's creating this dissonance in your brain. And psychology tells us that when you carry cognitive dissonance, that puts stress on your mental load, on your mental capacity, and it's really unhealthy for you. And I think what Rhett is experiencing here is anytime something alleviates that mental load, it's like coming up for air, because the cognitive dissonance can quieten for a little bit.
Got into this book. I dove right in. Now, pretty early in the book, Collins starts talking about the undeniable evidence for evolution. Evidence that humans evolved from a common ancestor with apes. And I was like, what? Hold up, y'all. What? This guy's a Christian? What? I know that's not true. And of course, because he's a geneticist, he's focusing on DNA and sort of the molecular evidence for this. So one thing that he talked about was sort of earth-shaking to me. This is going to get technical, so please hold on. And that is this idea that the second chromosome in people is a fused chromosome. So the second chromosome is fused. According to evolutionary theory, we're closely related to great apes and most closely related to the chimpanzee. Now, all great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes, right? But we, if you've ever been to 23andMe, you know this, we have 23. So if apes and humans are closely related, like evolution suggests, then it seems that a common ancestor to both humans and apes had his or her chromosomes fused together. DNA is basically an instruction manual on how to build something, how to build an organism, right? So let's just simplify this and just say that this book is 24 pages long. And let's say on page 2 are the instructions on how to make a hand. And on page 3 are the instructions on how to make a foot. And so that's what you see when you look at a chimpanzee. But then when you look at a human, you see that it goes from page 2 to page 4, and there is no page 3. But then you look closely at page 2 and realize that it's page 2 and page 3 glued on top of each other, and you see the instructions for the hand and the instructions for the foot on this long page 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's a simple explanation or a simple analogy for kind of understanding this.
This is why our feet and hands are stuck together.
Exactly.
And apes are not.
Again, this is a grossly simplified analogy, but it does help to understand it.
Helpful.
Now, but furthermore, there are these things called telomeres at the end of chromosomes, which basically are these like redundant material that basically protects the DNA structure, right? And so so think of it like you've got a header and a footer on a page, right? So there's always a header and there's always a footer on a page. And if you were to take 2 pages and glue them together, in the middle of those 2 pages, there would be a header and a footer glued together, right? If you take 2 pages and you glue them on top of each other, like a really long page,
yeah,
a header and footer would be touching each other. Well, we see 2 telomeres, 2 vestigial telomeres, directly on top of each other in the middle of the second chromosome, right? So all the evidence is pointing to these things being fused. Now, the reason this rocked my world so much is because I was familiar with the argument that almost 99% of our DNA is the same as chimpanzees. Everybody knows that because the human genome has been mapped. But the creationist answer to that is, well, yeah, I mean, God is he's using the same building materials to make similar things. It's his prerogative how he does it. So, of course, you're going to look at this instruction manual and you're going to see that, yeah, it's kind of the same, and then it's sort of different in some key ways. Like, that's God's prerogative. Why can't he do that? But that doesn't seem like an adequate explanation to why it definitely feels like and looks like and seems to be very conclusive that we actually have the same chromosomes and they've been fused. That doesn't seem like consistent with the idea that this is just God's prerogative. But that wasn't the only thing. I was so interested.
It's the Occam's razor of it all, right? Why add in an unnecessary figure or entity to explain something that we already have a natural explanation for? Doesn't make sense.
In this particular thing, this DNA evidence, because I'd heard about the fossils and all that stuff, but this DNA stuff just seemed, this is like how we decide court cases, right? And this is how we convict people. This is how we can find out if somebody actually committed a crime. This is definitive stuff. And then I learned about retroviruses. So essentially, there are certain RNA viruses that when you become infected with them, they actually insert a copy of themselves into your DNA. So you can look at your DNA and you can be like, oh, you got that virus at that time. And then occasionally, these viruses, or this sort of retrovirus inside your DNA, will be passed down to your children. And that means it's endogenous, it's in your genes. Well, we actually see that we share these endogenous retroviruses with the organisms that we are closely related to. And the more closely related you are to them, the more retroviruses you have in common. Now, let me again, to take this manual, this instruction manual analogy further. Let's say you look at page 19 of a chimpanzee manual, and you see, halfway down on page 19, there's a coffee stain, like somebody spilled coffee on the manual. But it looks like a copy of a coffee stain, like there was an original and there was a coffee stain, and this seems like a copy of that, like somebody ran it through a Xerox machine. And then you look at a human instruction manual, and on page 19, you see the same exact copy of the same exact coffee stain in the same exact place.
Why would God do that, you're thinking?
And so then you think, well, it seems to me that the most logical conclusion is that these 2 manuals come from a common manual, that there's an ancient common ancestor
God doesn't make mistakes. Why would he recopy a stain?
That is the ancestor to both humans and great apes. And this is what you see. And these are just two small pieces of DNA evidence. And I'm not going to go into any more details. But let me just say that the main thing that this did for me is I had been told a lot of things about evolution. I had been told things growing up. And now I was questioning those things because I had been told that there's no real evidence. This is a desperate attempt to try to come up with some harebrained theory to just explain things. And I'm like, but this DNA stuff is pretty freaking conclusive. I can't imagine another way to. Now, I'm not saying there aren't explanations for this. I'm not saying you can't go to a creationist website and find that it's not like they don't know about this. They have an answer. I've read the answer. I find the answer to not be compelling in the least. But let me just say.
And I think that's actually what we get down to when you have logical people making logical arguments. When those logical people are either theist or atheist, it tends to be, what argument do you find compelling? There is this concept, what is it? It's like sensus divinitus, I want to say, is what it's called. Roughly, the concept is, if there's no God, why do human beings have this predisposition to having spiritual experiences, to believing in something bigger than themselves, to this weird divine spark that we all kind of feel innately? Why would we have that? What is the explanation for it? I think similarly, there is the atheist kind of explain away, even though I don't know if this is actually I think this is a hard question for atheists, but there has to be some reason why that's evolutionarily beneficial, or the thing you're actually feeling is consciousness or a certain way that your brain is firing, right? For the theist, it is, we feel this innate thing, right? There's this kind of teleological understanding of, but this can't be it, right? And I think that just speaks to what's compelling or not to you. And at the end of the day, when you have logical people making these arguments, that is what it comes down to, unless a grand experience kind of changes someone's mind.
Essentially, every criticism of evolution that I had held on to justify my unwillingness to believe in it turned out to be a misconception or a misrepresentation of the facts. And so after reading a bunch of books, talking to a lot of people, I didn't want to believe this. I'd spent my whole life not believing this and not wanting to believe this. But I kind of was just faced with this, that evolution was by far the best explanation for what we actually see in the real world. If you're interested in any further reading on this, there's a really good wiki entry called Chromosome 2, which breaks this down with resources. It's very well referenced. And there's a wiki entry called Evidence of Common Descent. But let me just say, I didn't want to believe this. It was incredibly problematic. And there were plenty of Christians very smart Christians, smarter than me, who didn't believe in it, who I could have stayed in that camp. But I just, in my heart, I didn't feel like it. I felt like I had to follow the truth. I thought that the truth had to be more important than my commitment.
And that's the compelling thing that I'm kind of talking about, right? It's like, in my heart, this is true.
Commitment to my beliefs. It had to be more important than my ideology. And I want to say that about, there's these plenty of Christian apologists. I don't think that they're being deliberately deceptive. I want to be clear about that. But I think that they're so committed to their belief system that they have become impervious to pretty straightforward information about this subject. But the thing that did for me is I had placed a lot of faith, not just in God, but in these people who helped me understand why I believed what I believed from an intellectual standpoint, right? I had a very real, emotional, personal, spiritual relationship with God that I was practicing. But there was this intellectual foundation that whenever I had a doubt, I would kind of retreat to this intellectual foundation. And all of a sudden, those people I've been trusting in, I began to doubt that I had been shown the truth or told the truth about other things, right?
So get to this answer in due time as you've planned it. But I guess my question is, when you came to grips with evolution, was it just, okay, now I'm going to incorporate that into my faith? You can understand and accept the process of evolution and still have faith. I mean,
well, yeah. So exactly.
You're not an atheist all of a sudden, right?
I think that is a really important point to bring up, actually, that there is a lot that you can incorporate into faith. And I think most Christians, I would hope a lot of Christians today, have this practice with evolution, right? Where it's an undeniable truth, but there is a way that we can understand the Bible through explanations. I think when I first started hearing about scientific things that were contradictory to things that I was being taught in a Christian environment, that was very much my response too, was not, oh, we'll throw the faith out. And the answer was readily available to me in my logic. And it was, oh, well, God created evolution. That is the way in which we have gotten to where we are now. That was a part of his perfect plan, was evolution. And in middle school, I went to a Christian middle school. We weren't allowed to hear about evolution in the science classroom. We actually actively watched documentaries explaining the fine-tuning argument to us through a science class. Insane. But that was very much where my mind went, was, well, I can believe in evolution and still believe in God. These things aren't mutually exclusive, until the natural conclusions of that started unraveling too. But I do think that surface is able to be held. And what we see a lot of Christians who have curiosity and curiosity about their doubts grapple with.
I was very unsettled, but then I was like, well, hold up. I mean, Francis Collins, the whole point of the book is that he believes in God because of what he's seen in the DNA. And he's a Christian. He's an evangelical Christian. And he believes in evolution.
He presented it as that was God's creative process, was
involved
evolution.
This stuff.
Yeah.
Not to mention, one of the most respected and revered philosophical Christian minds of all time, C.S. Lewis, was a theistic evolutionist. And so I knew I was in good company. So I was like, this doesn't mean I'm not a Christian. This just means that I'm a little disappointed in the way that this subject has been misrepresented by so many Christians.
And I think that's a huge key, is that when you begin to define things on your own, even if it sits within the couching of Christianity, the way it's been presented to you on the surface, you inherently are holding on to doubt for the institution, period. When I left this Christian middle school, I remember the middle school principal came to me and asked me, and she's like, I heard you're not coming back. And I said, nope, I am not coming back. And she said, why? And I had a lot of chutzpah as an 8th grader. But I remember telling her, I could sit here and tell you it's because of the mean girls and being made to feel less than by my fellow women that are supposed to be Christians and kind and walk and treat people like Jesus. But the real reason is that ever since I've been here in that school, I have only ever been told what my relationship with God is supposed to look like. And I fundamentally disagree with that. And of course the principal's like, well, what do you mean? Of course it's your relationship with God. No one would ever tell you that. And I said, no. I'm not saying that no one said that it's not my relationship with God. Everyone in a position of authority in this school has the same idea of what my relationship with God should look like. And I disagree. That is not a personal relationship with God. And anytime I raise a question or a doubt or anything at all, it is shut down because it does not fit within the frame of what that relationship with God is supposed to look like. And I disagree with that. And of course, she claimed that I was wrong and she would like the chance to prove me wrong. I said, you had 3 years to prove me wrong. And actually, all that I got was an excuse for why it's okay for middle school boys to call other middle school boys gay as an insult. All I got were my girlfriends lying about me behind my back and telling my secrets. All I got was a lot of un-Christian-like behavior and teachers criticizing me when I had questions. Valid questions. Because when you start questioning things, it plants that seed of doubt, not just in the faith, but in the institution of the faith. And if you don't believe in the institution, your faith looks much more personal. And slowly but surely it starts to look not very Christian because it doesn't follow the dogma that it is supposed to follow.
But again, my goal was let's stick with the truth. All truth is God's truth. I'm not going to be scared of the truth. God's in control. He's the one who's established.
And I think that's part of the problem is all truth is God's truth. Why is the church misrepresenting God's truth? That doesn't make sense. And it makes you question the church. Not God, but the church.
This entire universe, I shouldn't be afraid to poke and pry to any of this stuff, right? So that was when I kind of got into this world of theistic evolutionist Christians. There's a good book that I read called Coming to Peace with Science, Bridging the Worlds of Faith and Biology. A guy who believes in evolution but is a Christian. That was a helpful book for me. And then I got really involved, I wasn't involved, but I spent a lot of time at the website BioLogos, which is essentially a group of Christian scientists, and there's a bunch of articles there. It's still active. I haven't been there in a long time, but I checked recently. It's still there. It's still doing a lot of things. But things get pretty complicated at this point. Like once I started looking into this, so I'm going to give you the short version, if you can believe that this is the short version. But basically what you run into is that there's sort of two camps within people who sort of accept evolution. One camp believes that Adam and Eve are still real, and that they are either a special creation or they're sort of the result of the process, but they're actually real historical people because they need to be real and historical in order for the fall and then the gospel to kind of make sense. Got to be honest, I did not find all of those arguments felt really tenuous and just felt like you guys are, that you have to have Adam and Eve. And so you're sort of inserting them in a way that they're not really fitting as a little, square peg, round hole situation.
I remember the Tim Keller book, Reason for God. I remember discussing that at that time and that being, as I remember it, his position.
Yeah, and this is problematic though, because I was like, I just don't think there's a way that Adam and Eve were real as presented in the Bible. But like I said earlier, they're presented in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Luke. So what's the deal, y'all? You know what I'm saying? This is a problem. This is a problem. But what this...
You start questioning Jesus's genealogy. At what point do you start questioning Jesus? Which... I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who wouldn't say Jesus was a good person. And again, we know that he's a historic figure, but poses a problem.
I just felt like this doubt was kind of creeping beyond the point of creation, and it was creeping into the Old Testament itself, because that's the way the story goes. You got Adam and Eve, and then you got a story that begins with them and moves all the way down to Abraham and Moses and then David. You got it's all part of a system. So again, I had been told, there was something I'd been told about the Old Testament, and that was the Old Testament is always supported by archaeological evidence. I'd heard that from so many Christians. It's like, sometimes they see something in the Bible and they're like, well, there's no evidence for that. And then they dig a little bit deeper and they're like, oh, we found the evidence. Or they find basically the idea that the Bible is always vindicated because the Bible is completely true in everything that it touches upon. But when I really looked into it, I started realizing that's
How often are those things just things that people were told and didn't think twice about and then continue telling to other people, and those people continue telling to other people?
not true. That's not really the case. Just a few things. I'm touching on some quick things. Why is there no Egyptian historical record of the Israelites' captivity? It's 2 million people. They kept great records. Why are they not? Why is there no record of them? Why is there no archaeological evidence of the Exodus? Basically, this massive group of people wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They've looked for over 100 years. They've looked. No evidence. Why does the modern archaeological evidence call Joshua's conquest of Canaan into question? Why is there good reason to believe that the Israelites arose not out of conquest or force, but by simply branching off of the Canaanites? And those are just a few things. But there are some pretty major events that all of a sudden I was like, no, this isn't well supported. This isn't outside of the Bible. These things are not well supported. I was even further troubled, right? And so I'm losing my faith in the Old Testament, but I'm also losing my faith in those same Christian thinkers who have said all this stuff that, like, guys, you this is solid as a rock. You can stake your entire life on these truths. And
The doubt isn't just in the faith, because you can explain the way of the faith for yourself to make it make sense to you. The doubt is in the structure, in the system that has lied to you. But that system relies upon the lie, because if you keep pulling on it, you get to this point, right? We also begin to see the pattern of New Testament Christians, right? That almost talk about the Old Testament as like, well, we just kind of ignore that, which is crazy to me. There is something very, like, kind of Gnostic about that, in the sense that it's like, well, the Old Testament God's not the New Testament God. But that was kind of the version of the Bible that I was served, was like, well, yeah, the New Testament's there and it's important and it teaches us things, but, like, that's not really the God we worship. And then that was just kind of it.
so I was in crisis at this point. But here's what I said. I said, does this Old Testament stuff really matter? Like, is this really what this is all about?
There it is.
Isn't the important thing Jesus, right? If this is about a relationship with Jesus, does this Old Testament stuff, first of all, okay, maybe there's no archaeological evidence for this stuff. Maybe there's no historical evidence but you can't really make an argument from nothing. It's like just the absence of evidence is not necessarily an argument against something. So these things could have happened. We just haven't found them. We haven't found them yet. But we can still have faith and believe them. And plus, like I said, isn't this just about Jesus? Now, let me be clear. I was still living in North Carolina at the time. I was still leading a small group Bible study at my church that I had been leading for many years. And I still consider myself a Christian. And I was slowly letting people that I loved, including my wife, in on some of this stuff. And every time I would bring up a piece of it, she would just start crying.
And to superimpose that on...
Isn't it interesting that all of these doubts, and I don't think that he was sharing these doubts with the youth group he was leading, right? It just goes to show that even the people in positions of power are clinging to these narratives too. It's like when your doubt not only calls into question your faith, but your role as a leader in this thing that is the most important thing in your life. And further than that, if you start to talk about the doubt, aren't you just spreading that doubt to other people? You're not proselytizing, you're doing the opposite of God's work. And also, if I just keep doing it, if I just keep spreading the word of God, if I just continue on and bring more and more people to God, I will find resolution. It will resolve. I'll be able to get through this. And if other people start doubting, it kind of crumbles. And so these people in positions of power, not only does it undermine their worldview and their livelihood, but it undermines exactly where they draw their power from.
last week's conversation in terms of timing from graduation to being an engineer to being on staff with crew.
So where I'm at right now with this whole like losing faith in the Old Testament and the archaeological evidence, we're probably talking about like 09, 10 at that point. So right as we're kind of wrapping up, we had left staff by this point. But the early stuff about evolution, that was 06, right? So that was the year that we left staff. And then the few years before that, I was where I kind of spent most of my time just thinking about like the old Earth, young Earth stuff. I've spent a few years and probably 5 years in that place. Again,
so at least not being on staff, there is a little bit of a pressure release to be able to at least start to broach these conversations with Jesse.
When you're in full-time ministry,
that
you
pressure.
have absolutely no impetus to actually explore these things because that's your well-being, that's your livelihood. Why are you going to threaten that? You don't want to consider these things because you don't want to be like, if I actually consider this, am I going to end up having to not be a preacher anymore? Am I going to have to drop out of seminary? Am I going to stop being a missionary?
Yeah.
Or for
Your
us.
entire life path.
So much stuff for that.
It was your full-time job.
Yeah.
And it was, as we've talked about, we were so fully engaged and committed to working within those parameters to pursue.
And what I said earlier about it undermining power, I don't mean that about Rhett or Link. I more mean that about like grown-ass adults that are using the position of pastor or priest to have power. And I think people in power right now that are using religion in a really twisted, maligned way to retain and hold on to their power over America as a country and other countries too.
To our dreams, even not fully understanding that that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
But I think subconsciously you don't want to really engage in anything that's going to threaten that, but you couldn't help yourself. I mean, it was just your nature to this concept of truth. I think is the thread, and again, it started, like you said, in high school, but it brought us to this point. So back to what you're saying,
I remember being told growing up that Jesus was the truth. He is the way, the truth, and the light. So imagine learning something that someone who told you that also said isn't true. What even is the definition of truth at that point? What does truth look like? It really is such subconscious turmoil, and that, like I talked about a little bit earlier, the cognitive dissonance that you hold with that puts so much stress on your brain and on your mind, and you're developing and growing. And I'm like, no wonder I developed anxiety. Right?
We had left staff. We were making it on our own. You're still very much involved in the church. You're teaching people. You're having these conversations with Jessie, and you get into a little bit of it, and she breaks down
every time. This is
something I continually return to when I think about Rhett and Link's deconstruction specifically, is their marriages and how those have evolved with them through this process. I would say I pray to God. I do, to my God. I pray to God that if I get married one day, it is to someone that has that kind of devotion to me. That is the kind of marriage I want, that is based in faith in each other, in the promise that we make to one another. I just have endless respect for that part of this puzzle too.
Traumatic for her. Every time I would bring it up, and of course I would wait until it had become unbearable for me, and then I would bring it up to her because I'm trying to respect her, and it's like we're raising these kids, and
I know how important this stuff is
also
for her.
Kids, my word.
And she was very educated in all this too. We would argue about the young Earth thing when we were dating in college because that was her perspective, her background, and it was not easy for our marriage. And
yeah, because you don't want to bring it up early because it's a tough thing to. It may pass. Yeah. It's a tough thing to bring up. So it sounds like you start to bring it up when you, like you said, you can't.
When I got
cannot bring it
something-
up, and then it's almost you've reached a conclusion about something, and then you're spilling your guts to her and expecting her to. She's late to the process, which is actually even more difficult.
Yeah. And you mentioned that thing about like the concern was with truth. And I don't know where this comes from. This is my disposition. My dad was a lawyer and is a law professor. He's got a very specific way of kind of getting to the bottom of things. And I think, so it's kind of in my DNA to be concerned about truth. But I think ultimately it was like, again, back to what I said at the beginning, is the whole point is that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. This is the truth. You find the truth.
Okay, I know I have listened to this before, but it has quite literally been like, I've probably rewatched it, so at least 3 years since I've seen this. Wow, yeah, obviously, agree.
The truth sets you free. Truth. The whole point of the Bible,
Capital T.
While people defend the Bible and say that the Bible is inerrant, without error, it is from God. It's written by God through people. The whole point of all that is because it being true is paramount. Maybe more so than any other faith. The holy text being true is so.
I do disagree with maybe more than any other faith. The Quran, I know, there is not this same dichotomy between the word of God being kind of inspired through the writers, the people who physically write, but that it is the word of God. I might be wrong about this, but I believe that the Quran is supposed to be 100% fully the word of God, from God, like straight from the horse's mouth. And I think that actually poses a lot more difficulty because every single word of it must be true. And any spot of doubt is direct doubt in your higher power. I think at least with Christianity, there is a little bit of wiggle room in this. Well, it was inspired by God. Humans are fallible. Humans are imperfect. What if there was some, miscommunication, misquoting, mistranslation along the way? Of course, I'm sure there are those arguments for the Quran as well. I'm not as familiar with them, but something interesting to think about there within that, the importance of a holy text. I will say, before I fully deconstructed and said I am no longer a Christian, I do not hold that title. My position about the Bible very much was, it is completely a story. Everything is just a story to illustrate some higher point. And, God's a creative writer. Doesn't mean he believes everything he wrote, which I think is kind of what you have to get to if you're holding the Old Testament at all as the Word of God, because there's some not so great stuff in there. You really need to come up with a way to make it make sense for yourself. And at a certain point, it's like, why the hell am I trying so hard to make this make sense? What am I holding on to? Everything you've ever been told, all of these relationships, any sort of power that you have as a position of authority in the church, your marriage, your kids, your family. It is kind of similar to cults in the sense that it's like truly leaving behind everything that you've ever known. And there's no going back once you've crossed that line. And I think that is why you see so many people hang on as long as they can. I mean, even me, for the longest time, I would be like, well, I'm a Christian, but of course there are truths to be found in Judaism and Buddhism. And I was reading the Mahamudra when I still considered myself to be a Christian, right? And why did that title mean so much? It's easy just to have that as your fallback and let people assume what it means for you, right? Well, yeah, I'm a Christian. You can assume what that means, and people largely assume that it's the same thing that it means for them. That is not what it meant for me for a long, long time, until I finally got to a place where I was like, yeah, I'm not a Christian. And then I kind of circled back for a little bit and said, well, actually, I think by some definitions, I would be considered a Christian because I do believe love God, love each other, act like Jesus. I to this day believe in those things that I just said. But Christianity by the book is believing that Jesus is the one and only begotten Son that was sent on the cross to die for our sins so that we may have everlasting life. And that, I don't believe, is the only way.
Oh, it's a linchpin, right? Now, okay.
Linchpin's a great word.
Just one more thing. You had mentioned there were two camps when you were talking about about the Bible being literally what actually happened versus Adam and Eve being figurative. I don't know if you were coming back to that or not, but it seemed like, again, we're at a point where there's how you just described, that's a certain subset of Christian faith that believes those things about the Bible.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty fitting that at this point we moved to California. 2011, we moved to California, got involved in a church, an evangelical church, met some great people, made some great friends. And this is when I adopted what I'm going to call California Christianity, to get at what Link was getting at here a second ago. In LA, even within the evangelical church, I think there is this sort of, because you're in this incredibly diverse place with so many different perspectives, you really can't maintain a Christian faith in a place like this without at least some sort of realization that there's a lot of gray. It's not about
having it all figured
this
out.
process.
It's not about being completely certain. It's about a relationship with Jesus. And
this self-definition, right? That really is the next phase of this, is like, okay, I don't really trust the church. I don't really believe, even if the people who taught me growing up actually believe it. Jury's out on that for a lot of people, but even if they really believe it and believe that this is what's best, and I do think that most people do, and any good Christian does, right? They hold that with conviction, as long as they're not like actively manipulating you as bad people. But there's bad people everywhere in any organization or religion. But that is the way this process goes. When I no longer trust the system, I no longer trust the organization, I don't trust the process, this has to be a personal thing, and I need to define it for myself, and then it just keeps going.
This was like a kind of a breath of fresh air for me, honestly, coming to California with all these doubts. I found these Christians who had these doubts, Christians who saw the Bible differently, who were like, yeah, man, I don't know exactly what happened. Evolution seems like it probably did happen. And Adam and Eve might not have been real, but like, that's not my day-to-day with Jesus, man. You know, and so I have a relationship with Jesus. I wrote in my journal, 2011, my faith is still weak.
I actually think that that's really, really beautiful. That's not my day-to-day with Jesus. I think that's the piece of Christianity that is magic. It truly is this communion with something bigger than yourself that makes you loved and loving. That is how I define my spirituality now today. And I do think that by that definition, maybe I would be considered Christian, but in so many other ways, I am not. And I think that a lot of fundamentalist Christians would look at what Rhett just said about these people kind of saying, yeah, I get it and I hear it, but that's not what's important to me about the religion. It's the practice, it's the ritual, it's the day-to-day, and say they're not real Christians either, right? There is this kind of infighting of belief and disbelief and what's real and what's not, and what does Christian actually mean within any religion that exists, within any identity that exists, right? Of course, I told the story of middle school, and I do think by the time I got there, I was already beginning to have this own definition of like, okay, well, my elementary school best friend is not going to hell, so that whole thing in the Bible can't exactly be true. And mom and dad don't really care that we don't go to church anymore, so that can't really be true. We don't pray before dinner, but I still pray every night before bed, which I think was largely an anxiety response, actually, because I would sit there and list out, please keep my mom safe, keep my dad safe, keep my brother safe, keep my grandma safe, keep my other grandma safe, keep my grandpa safe, keep my aunt safe, and go through every single member of my family and ask for their protection. And I would say every single night, I believe that Jesus is your only one and begotten Son, and that he died on the cross for my sins, and I am eternally grateful, and this is me giving my heart to you, Lord, for a spot at everlasting life in heaven with you, because I was so terrified that somehow my giving my heart away to God didn't count all the other times that I did it, and I needed to do it every day to kind of re-up. And I asked for like no fires and no big diseases and no car crashes. Like there are very specific things that I would list out. This clearly sounds like anxiety and OCD, right? We see where how my brain works. But even then I was defining this for my own. It was, I think middle school is when the like institution, not just doubts in the Bible, but in the structure of church, of like leadership there, really settled in. And then I started reading the Mahamudra. I started diving into Buddhism. That was kind of my first foray into a belief system that was external to Christianity. And it completely opened my eyes to, well, Jesus actually lived a lot like how a Buddhist should live. And Buddhism, sure, I guess they kind of worship the Buddha, but he's not a god in the same way that our God is God. And it's really more of a philosophy than a religion. And then I started diving into philosophies, and again, it just snowballed. 7th, maybe 8th grade is also when I found tarot. And having this other kind of occult practice was this kind of taboo, secret way for me to rebel against all of these people that said your religion has to be this certain way. Having my own definition that like, well, of course God can speak to me through tarot. Why not? What does God have against that? Was this kind of like practice of developing this relationship with my own source, my own higher power that was so different than how these other people conceptualized of God. And I think that's really when this kind of tarot, Buddhism, disbelief in the structure, triad, trinity, if you will, was kind of the breaking point that pushed me into, okay, I don't think I'm a Christian. And by 9th grade, it was, I'm ready to explore other paths to meaning.
But it is not gone, and possibly God is revealing a foundation that he can build real faith upon. Here are a few things that have hit me recently. From an intellectual standpoint, I may never have certainty about my faith. That pursuit may be fruitless. It's becoming clearer that the significance of my faith, or the so-called proof of Christianity, is not found in a well-reasoned argument. Rather, it rings true the way a musical note would. It hits my resonant frequency. And that was very reassuring to me.
I do think that there is something extremely beautiful in that. I remember asking my mom at like 6 years old, being like, Mom, I want to get baptized. Please, can I get baptized? And she's like, let's wait until you're older and understand what that is. Thank you, Mom. But this like crazy, strong feeling, sensus divinitas, I hope that I'm saying that right, but connection to something bigger than myself, spark, purpose, reason for being here. The language I was given to understand that was Christianity, was Jesus. And so I latched onto that with a ferocity because it's so strong. When that language was stripped away, all I was left with was that feeling and nothing to describe it. And so I was kind of scrambling around looking for something to describe it with. And having the doubt that I did in the structure that was Christianity, I don't think I then at this point in the story that I'm kind of telling about myself, or now in my life, really believe that any story or language we have to talk about it is completely true. And that's why I kind of have this hodgepodge and this mishmash. I have not found anything that explains that resonance, except for my lived experience, except for maybe poetry. More on that as we go.
At the time, when we moved to LA, I was like, man, in this kind of crazy world with people trying to be all about themselves, and this place, it's all about making an entertainment business. I've got my faith. I've got my relationship with Jesus. I've got my Christian community. And I don't have it all figured out, and it is great, but it feels so true, and it proves itself out to be true in my daily life. I tried living like this. I ran into a few problems.
The music did not continue to resonate in your bosom.
Basically, the foundation of my faith ultimately was still the Bible, even if I had sort of a more liberal view or more gray view of what the Bible might mean and represent. And so every time I read the Bible, I saw issues with it. Every time I heard a sermon, I would have an issue with it. My experience with Christianity was basically inflaming my doubts and my questions. So the closer I got to it, the more I couldn't quite shake these questions.
I think that that's a really wise framing of this, and why this is kind of my point from what I was saying earlier about why people in power need to keep truth and questioning away from Christianity. I think my gut instinct when I was little was, but younger, there is this like truth, this resonance that we all feel. Why can't that just be framed through Christianity and this kind of idea of what Rhett's talking about, of like, it bears out in my daily life and I have this connection to God and Jesus's behavior is beautiful and love God and love each other, and it just be about love. It's because when you hold on to that doubt, it constructs why the institution is there at all. I do think, even though most churches are nonprofit, everything like this, under capitalism, is run as a business. And there is something about that here that's like, a religion is a business in a certain sense. A church is a business. Offering plates are always passed around to keep the church going. And the currency that they run on is your faith. And if there is doubt to be had, it completely undermines the need for a church. I mean, it's almost the Catholic fear of Protestantism, right? Like, if you don't need to pay me to have this, forgiveness with God in confession, the church isn't going to exist. But that's really scary to churches.
That continued to linger. And the place that I had sort of put a barrier around and said, we're not going there. Sure, we can talk about evolution. We can talk about the historicity of the Old Testament. But where I'm not going to go is I'm not going to go to Jesus. I'm not going to question Jesus. But I just couldn't help myself, because I was like, my understanding of who Jesus is not just based on my experience with him personally, but it's also based on what the Bible has to say about him. This is how we know what there is to know about Jesus. And again, when I looked into this, my world was rocked in a very big way. I'm not going to give sufficient detail here. Lots of people have gone and done this who are smarter and more educated than me. But basically, there are just as many views on this as there are people who study it. But essentially, I had lived my whole life being sure that the Gospels were historically reliable, almost taking it for granted. I mean, I'd read Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict and Josh McDowell's New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I had read Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. I could spit these arguments back out to you on an airplane and make you think that, whoa, I should be a Christian.
Why on an airplane, by the way?
Because when you're an evangelical Christian and you sit next to a stranger, this may be the only opportunity you ever have to share the life-changing message of Jesus with them.
That's that pressure I was talking about. Terrifying for a young kid. For a young kid whose best friend was Baha'i. For a young kid whose other friends were Mormon and atheist. Terrifying. The pressure of that everyone around me has their eternal salvation resting in my ability to convince them. It's too much.
Lots of the conversations that involved airplane evangelism, because it was just like his captive audience.
Yeah.
It's like, you're going to go this whole flight and not say anything?
Right. What if it crashes? But I took a second to go one layer deeper and to look at the answers to the Christian answers that I had been given all my life. And that was when I realized that this Jesus thing was very, very messy from a historical standpoint. There's a few books that do a good job of outlining some of this stuff. One of them is Jesus Interrupted by Bart Ehrman. who's a professor of New Testament at UNC, who incidentally, Jesse was in his class, and she used to come home every single day, and then we would come up with ways to go back to argue against him, ironically. Me and you were actually involved in a Campus Crusade initiative on the campus of UNC to kind of combat what he was doing because he was having so much influence on the students. So I understood Bart Ehrman had been the enemy for so long, but what I started to realize is that he had a very similar story, and I thought that he dealt with the subject matter in an honest and even-handed way. There's also a book called The Historical Jesus, 5 Views, which kind of runs the spectrum, runs the gamut on how you can see this. But basically what I just saw is that there's so many people coming at this with an intention to uncover the truth, to find the truth, and they're coming to these wildly different conclusions. This isn't like science. You know, somebody does a scientific experiment in 1985 in China, and then somebody does the same scientific experiment in 2019 in California. If everything is controlled, they're going to come to the same conclusion.
That's not how
Should,
history
if it's
works.
good science.
And it makes it very difficult to come to definitive conclusions about things. But essentially, in the end, by far, to me personally, the most compelling and seemingly reasonable view was that the Gospels appear to be a mix of religious propaganda as well as actual history. So there's definitely some history in there. I think Jesus was a real person, so does Bart Ehrman. But I don't think that
As
I
he
do
is
think that's
presented there
pretty
is
definitive
completely
among
reliable.
historians now.
that's what I was thinking at the time.
So what did you believe about Jesus? You reached a conclusion about the person of Jesus at that time when you were researching that.
I had a picture of Jesus that was the picture that I had always had of this person who did these miracles and died on the cross and rose again and died for my sins and was God in the flesh. All the things that were important to believe about him. But I had doubts about those things being true, but I didn't have another picture of Jesus. There was no other picture of Jesus.
So you read all these books, you did all this research about Jesus, but your conclusion was not really a conclusion at that point.
Oh yeah, I was still in process. And so this was incredibly unsettling, right?
I'll say the way I dealt with this unsettling feeling at this point in my deconstruction as well was to say, okay, we don't know what happened, right? And at that point, I didn't really know much about the historicity. Apologies. I didn't have the same knowledge around the historical nature of the Gospels or Jesus as an actual person. But my conclusion was kind of, okay, whether or not Jesus was real, whether or not these stories are literally true or supposed to be metaphorically true, inspired through some God, and this is just a message, I believe in the goodness of the acts that I read about. Almost like when I read Hunger Games, and I'm like, okay, I believe that Katniss is a fallible human character, but I believe in the goodness of her actions, right? In standing up against tyranny, in these things as principle. I know she's fictional. I know she's a fictional character, but I can still take inspiration from that. And that was very much how I held Jesus. But even beginning to think of the Bible as a story of fiction was like, what's the line between worship and lessons? Between sermons and growth, right? Between this is a commandment from an almighty, all-knowing God and just something that is good for this life. And the afterlife was kind of brought into this question for me too at this point, because for a little bit having this idea of like, okay, I believe these things to be true. It makes me a good person right here, right now. There was always this lingering question of like, eternity sounds terrifying to me, whether it's heaven or not. I keep saying I remember and telling a story, but it's part of this process, right? I remember the first time someone described eternity to me. It was in a Mother's Day Out program at the church that my family did go to when we regularly went to church for like 6 years when I was little. And at Mother's Day Out programs, we would watch VeggieTales and get lessons from our teachers. I remember our teacher talking to us about like forever in heaven with God is what is waiting for you. Isn't that so exciting? Forever. You have forever with God. And like little 5-year-old me, I remember my blood like went cold and I was like, forever? I don't, like, never ending. That's terrifying. How is that real? How does that work? And it quite literally, like, took my breath away in the sense that it was like, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Even now, the idea of doing anything for forever, like, that's nightmare fuel to me. That is like some Lovecraftian horror that my brain has cooked up that's more scary than any reality, right? And so I think when looking at these different spiritualities, religions, philosophies, I needed it to make sense for this life and how I live and the things that I believed to be true about this reality. But I also needed it to cache for the afterlife. You'll also notice the shift in the language I just used, and I want to come back to that because I think it's important. I said I needed these spiritualities or philosophies or worldviews to make sense to me for how I lived this life. It's at this point that I think you start shifting the way you think about spirituality or religion or philosophy. Worldview. I'll just use the word worldview from here on out to kind of describe that array of things. You begin to shift from needing an externally validating source of truth to that source of truth being internal. No longer is my source of truth God, Jesus, the Bible, some external thing that I have been told is the way, the truth, the light, the capital T truth. Because the only capital T truth that I have any knowledge of is me, is my experience, is my lived reality. And so when you're working from a place of doubt, it is this almost Cartesian exercise of like, dump all the apples out of the basket and add them back in one by one until you come to a like rational conclusion of the world. And what's the one thing you can start with? I think, therefore I am. Like, the only thing we can start with without any prior knowledge is that I am aware of myself. I am aware of my experience. I am aware. And even then, there's some arguments to be had against Descartes and this whole thing and how Descartes uses God as well. But for the sake of this explanation, right? When you've tossed God out, or the structure around God that you had is a bad apple, and you want to figure out how to add those apples back in, you end up starting from self. And I think that's a really primal shift in reconstruction. And if you hear me talk at all about deconstruction, I almost always say reconstruction too, because my deconstruction happened at such a young age that I was also, I mean, we're all constantly learning and growing, but I was like building up Christianity as I was doubting it at the same time, and then also learning about other worldviews. So my deconstruction was also deeply a reconstruction, and I think everyone has a bit of this. So I think the important difference, though, is deconstruction is like throwing out that bad apple. Reconstruction is identifying yourself as your source of truth and moving forward.
This was way more unsettling than anything that had happened so far, because this was Jesus. This was the core of everything. This is who my relationship was with, and all of a sudden, I've got very serious doubts about him.
And I think that anyone that you would have conversations with, and you did initiate with not only Jesse, but with me and with other people that you confided in
their friendship
over this decade.
So beautiful.
Of going through this. If you were talking to someone who was still very much committed to their faith, it was like much more solid, I think the response, maybe it's not spoken, is, well, yeah, as long as you hold on to Jesus and you know, it's like that, you can't let go of that. You can let go of everything else, but you can't really let go of what you believe about Jesus raising from the dead and paying the penalty for your sins instead of you.
Yeah.
It's either you go to hell or he does, which he already did and came back.
Right.
Is the belief. So you can let other stuff go and maybe not panic. And again, I'll share my perspective on interacting with you more next week. But
it is really interesting that is kind of the belief in the reason why Jesus paid the ultimate sacrifice is not just that he was crucified, but that he goes to hell. But we don't have any historical evidence for Jesus, the actual human being resurrected. And of course, this is getting into literal versus figurative definitions of readings of the Bible. But what a funny thought experiment that if you hold this to be true, and that the resurrection is actually just a metaphorical kind of explanation for Christ's divinity, the actual figure Jesus is just still chilling in hell. He's just in hell. Fascinating to think of Jesus being still in hell.
But at times that was part of it.
Yeah, because what you believe about Jesus is paramount, but what you believe about Jesus is still based on what is presented in the Bible. If not, where else are you getting it? I mean, some people might be like, well, I'm getting it directly from God. But that's not what Christianity teaches. It's coming from God
also
and
not
the Bible.
really
They don't contradict
true.
So when it became
You're being
clear to
told
me
this
that
from
it
other
wasn't
people.
something that I could have the same kind of faith in it that I've had, I had a meltdown. I didn't do anything crazy externally, but there was a lot happening internally. At this point, I said,
do you remember a time or a place associated with this?
well, I've got a couple of another journal entry that I'll go into, which is sort of the next stage of this thing. But
I love him using journal entries. It's really cool.
I do remember saying this at the time. I was like, God, you are bigger than all of this, right? I'm just this little human who sees through a glass darkly. I got this finite mind, and I'm trying to understand the infinite mind, the creator of the universe. Seems pretty arrogant.
Enter in my agnosticism. This idea that whatever God is, whatever consciousness is, whatever the universe is so vast that we will never be able to understand as a human being with this human brain. I still relatively believe that to be true, right? That I, as a cup of water that is filled with the ocean, right? Like if you take a cup and you dip it into the ocean, I am still ocean, but I am a cup of this ocean. How can I understand the vastness of the ocean? I have this cup that is fundamentally restraining my oceanness, right? I do hold that to be true. But when you get there, it's kind of like, well, if I can't understand it, it's gotta just be a question mark, right? And that kind of has to be the thing I hold on to.
I just felt like I was just completely in my mind, and I made this whole thing like scientific and intellectual. And also, it seemed like I was being arrogant because I was waiting for God to fit my expectations. I was creating God in my own image, as opposed to God creating me in his image.
Humans already did that, though.
On God, and was waiting for him to like be my little trick pony that does all the things that I want him to do in order for me to believe in him. There's a verse that kind of gets into
which
this.
was answers, basically.
Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts."
So God's saying, I'm bigger than you.
Right.
There's certain things you just can't get, dude.
Yeah. And at this point I was like, okay, you know what? I think this is probably where faith comes in. You know, it makes sense to me that this might be where faith comes in, because I am sitting here trying to prove this stuff out, but shouldn't I just have faith first? And then maybe these answers will be given to me by God. Isn't this what faith is all about? I mean, the whole point is it's evidence of things not seen, right?
And so your next step was, there's no way for me to know, but I'm going to try a different route, which is maybe faith needs to come first.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty here is, because I agree, I think that is kind of the next logical step as someone with this worldview that's been given to you is like, but this is everything I've been taught is when I'm questioning this, step into faith. We can't know. We can't know. That's what I've heard my whole life. I can't know. And I am just trying to know, and I never will. So just believe. The problem and the tension within the idea of faith is that it feels a lot like ignoring reality. And it has to be grounded in some experience that, while maybe ineffable, maybe unprovable, is true. It is that thing that Rhett said, like, rings true. You have to have that. That isn't proof. That isn't something that you can, like, sit down and convince someone with, but something that is true in your experience. And I think that's why a lot of conversions happen through, like, a near-death experience, or people don't believe in ghosts until they see one, right? It's kind of a similar thing. And it's like, you know, man, I can't convince you of it, but I had this experience. I have this feeling. And I think that goes back to what we deem as convincing for us as spiritual and logical beings, is like, okay, what is convincing? Like, I understand that, like, I can have logic and faith together, but logic also wants to say this experience I have of resonance, communion with something bigger than myself, is actually just my brain waves and neurons firing in a certain way, and that's what science says it is, and it kind of explains away that experience. But then faith is saying, well, no, trust your gut, trust your intuition, trust your lived experience. Like, those are the things that we know, and you will never know. Lean anyways, jump anyways, grow your wings on the way down. Trust me, like, Jesus will catch you, or whatever higher power will catch you. I think at this point, I've kind of moved past Christianity in my deconstruction, and I'm now looking at faith in anything, or atheism. Faith is not going to work unless it does. And, like, that's kind of the impossibility of it, is that, like, I can explain away the faith I have in something bigger than myself through all sorts of scientific things. I still believe it's there. And I can't really tell you why, but it's real to me. And it's convincing to me. So I think this is the piece of the puzzle that gets really, really hard.
And then we'll open up
in terms of
That'll
theism
lead to
versus
something.
atheism,
Yeah,
not
I can
necessarily
believe in a
just
Jesus
Christianity.
That I believe in, because that's what the Bible says. I can believe in the biblical Jesus, even though I have reasons that, from a historical perspective, to doubt that. I can still believe in it and overcome that. And this is when I ran into some problems. So the first thing was, how does this differentiate me from any other faith on earth?
He keeps saying, and this is when I ran into some problems. Same.
Earth, right? One of the things that makes Christianity unique is that, you know, it is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through the Son, right? You don't get to the Son through somebody else. You don't get to the Son through Buddha, right? But also, evangelical Christians tend to be pretty critical of other faiths. Mormonism is a perfect example, right? Mm-hmm. If you're in an evangelical church, or certain evangelical churches, you know, they teach you that Mormons basically have it wrong, that Mormonism is a bastardization of Christianity, right? It's not just another Christian group. And lots of Christians will write books that explain how all the things that Mormons believe about Joseph Smith and these things that happen are not true, and here's why. The Book of Mormon is not true, and here's why. So they can be very critical of that faith. But yet, if you say those things to a Mormon, they will say, well, I have a burning in the bosom that proves to me that these things are right. So you can tell me that these things seem wrong, and you can show me certain things, but I believe them to be true, and you can't change that because I have this sort of seal and sign from God this indication that this faith is real and this is all true. And I was like, hey, isn't that what I'm doing right now? I'm just saying that I'm just going to have faith that things are real. Damn the evidence. So how does that make me any different, right? And ultimately, this kind of faith felt a little cowardly to me, to be honest. It felt like what I was saying is, yeah, there's some conclusions that I really don't want to come to, and the way I'm going to avoid those is just by having faith. But ultimately, you just can't make yourself believe. You just can't make yourself.
And that's exactly what I was talking about. You can't force that point. If you don't just believe it, you won't. No amount of evidence or book or whatever is going to convince you if it's not convincing to you. I think also with this idea of well, then what makes Christianity different than any other religion? It's kind of a piece of that puzzle when I first started discovering tarot and occultism, and also started discovering Buddhism. I learned a lot about Hinduism as well, and the tradition of Abrahamic religions and Zoroastrianism, and where all these things come from, and putting them into historical context and how they're interrelated. It's what makes this one true? Why? And all of these different narratives coming together to weave this story. The thing that is actually common among religions is some sort of worldview for ethics or morals. And they all tend to be pretty similar in the sense that we should love God and love one another. Of course, there are different commandments and different specificities and laws and rules, but that being a common thread, that's fascinating to me. That's something that is convincing. I think that, again, is kind of part of this agnostic chapter in my life is hell, they're all a little bit true and they're all a little bit wrong. Which I think a lot of people kind of hold that are in this spiritual but not religious frame.
Have faith. This was a torturous place for me, right? And I was there for a very long time. There was lots of praying. There was lots of reading the Bible, which would inflame some of the same doubts. There was lots of talking to Christians openly about what was happening. I want to be very clear that I didn't go into a cave somewhere and come to these conclusions and never run them by. I didn't want to leave this thing, man. This was my life. This defined everything for me. This was the foundation of my marriage. This was the foundation of the way I was raising my kids. I didn't want it to go away. It was the orienting, purpose-driven worldview that was basically defined everything about me. But yet, I'm going through this process. I'm talking with people. I'm talking to my wife. She's crying.
Talking to me.
Yeah, talking to you. I was talking to you the entire time about this stuff. You didn't cry. Thank you.
I didn't cry.
A question I had never asked. I've been very, very afraid to ask this question, and that was,
it would have been okay if you did cry.
What if I'm wrong? What if I opened myself up to the possibility that maybe I have been wrong about this? I want to be clear. I had never done that. Even in all these things that had shaken me, right? All these doubts that I had, I still was there was this Christian core that was completely protected through all this that I wasn't willing to let go of. But I was like, what if I am wrong?
I think it's interesting because I didn't have that what if I am wrong feeling around Christianity. I don't think I had this Christian core. I think that comes in this agnostic versus atheist kind of turn that I take a few years later, a few years back from now. What if I'm wrong came later for me. I think it was easier for me to leave the idea of Christianity than it was for me to leave the idea of God altogether. I don't consider myself an atheist now. No spoils as to what I consider myself now, but that was really a turning point for me. And in this feeling, like Rhett just said, it was torturous. I think that was the real piece of that for me, was okay, Jesus isn't the only way. There still has to be something bigger than myself. This isn't all there is. Life isn't pointless. Life isn't meaningless. There is a divinity, right? And then I think around 21, 22 is kind of when I had the like, what if I'm wrong about that? Because Occam's razor, right? Why add a God if there is a scientific explanation for why I'm here right now?
Can I just live like that for a little bit? I'm pretty good at kind of giving myself over to things, right? I can watch a movie and get lost in it. I can read a book, I can get lost in it. I can read a book from a different perspective, and I can adopt that perspective for a little bit to see what it feels like. And I decided that I was going to do that. It's like, let's just consider what it would mean if you were wrong. What would that mean about the Bible? And when I was honest with myself, the Bible began to make a lot more sense to me personally as a product of humans rather than God. It seemed less and less like God's message to people and more like people's best guesses about God. And in that, it became a lot like any other holy text. And when I came to that conclusion, I wasn't fully there, I was just considering, what does it feel like to think this? It led to a few more questions that I'd always been afraid to ask myself. I'm going to read these because I wrote them down. These are just a few of the questions I'd always avoided. If I don't have to believe that God ordered his chosen people to slaughter men, women, and children by the thousands, then why would I? If I don't want to believe that every religious experience of any person who is not a Christian is ultimately illegitimate, then why would I? If I don't have to believe that anyone who doesn't have a relationship with Jesus, i.e. the majority of people who have ever lived, are going to spend eternity being literally tortured in a fire, experiencing never-ending pain and suffering, then why, no pun intended, in the hell would I believe that? And if I can somehow accept the idea that hell exists because of God's holiness, why would I believe in a God who would choose to create that particular world where people have no choice whether or not they're going to be born? But then once they are born, if they don't adopt the correct understanding of God, he will punish them forever. Why believe in that God if I don't have to? So where did this lead me?
Because the answer to those questions are that there's a lot of fear of what you might lose or experience, but there are some things to gain.
Yeah.
If you go to the other side.
Well, it's funny because I had spent a lot of time in my head, a bunch of like intellectual processing of all these things, right? Mm-hmm. Philosophical stuff. But at this point, as I felt this sort of traditional faith slipping away, I started worrying about some pretty practical things. Like, how is my marriage going to stay together? What am I going to teach my kids? This is what I've been teaching them. What am I going to teach them now? What am I going to do? Where am I going to turn? What's going to replace this? This is community. This is purpose. This is meaning. Where am I going to find something like that? You know, and a verse came to mind, John chapter 6, after Jesus has kind of talked about him being the flesh, and he's kind of basically given the whole idea of, communion at this point. And it's a difficult teaching, and a lot of people walk away because they're like, he's talking about eating him and drinking his blood. This dude's nuts. And it was a difficult teaching. People didn't understand what he was getting at, and they walk away. Mm-hmm. So Jesus asked the 12, do you want to leave too? Simon Peter replied, Lord, to whom would we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And that's what I said. I was like, listen, I got nowhere else to go. What am I going to become?
When I first watched this video, I can't watch that part without tearing up, because there is just something so profound about the shift from logical, philosophical reasoning and reflection to practical consideration and the felt experienced of what it is to observe the Bible and the teachings of the church from outside. And at this point, Rhett clearly feels outside of it. And to look at these things that the Bible tells us God has done. And if I don't have to believe that God is all powerful, all knowing, all good, and still wants to punish me, why would I? Why would I believe in a God that seems like for some reason they have it out for me? That I am innately dirty and sinful because of something I didn't do. Why? Why would I do that to myself? And it is its own special kind of torture to think about how you did believe that for so long. That you did do that to yourself. That you still do it to yourself because it's indoctrinated. It's ingrained. It's the water, right, that we swim in, especially in America, but also in the Bible. Well, in America, but especially in the Bible Belt. This narrative of, I will never be good enough, is drilled into your brain. And the being that is judging you for never being good enough needs you to prove yourself through doubt, through lack of logic, through things that don't make sense. But that being kills, is jealous, is angry, orders slavery, orders raping and pillaging, lies. In Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve, do not eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, for you will surely die. They eat the fruit. They don't die. God kicks them out. What the fuck? And you're telling me the snake is the devil? Yeah, tough titties. I'm not believing that. And the fact that I still struggle with loving myself, a lot of this is also the woman's experience in the church, right? And how femininity and womanhood is treated in the church. But that's a whole other thing that I can't get into in this reaction video. But those questions that he asks are so poignant. And it has been a lifetime of work for me to continue working on this and understanding why I still struggle with loving myself. Anyways.
Now, let me make it clear. I was in a state of panic at this point. But I was like, I can't let this go. There's too much wrapped up in this, right?
It's everything.
But this is where being in Los Angeles did allow me to ask a different question. And let me explain that. First of all, I have no doubt that many people will probably not even listen to this story. In fact, I've seen it on Twitter. I've already seen people say, I don't want to listen to their personal stories because I don't want to hear somebody talk about leaving, which that hurts me that you don't want to listen to the story because I'm just trying to be honest. But I know a lot of people will come to the very, very easy conclusion. Guys, there's nothing surprising about this. You were Christians and then you went to Los Angeles and you lost your faith. It's a story as old as Los Angeles. This isn't surprising.
It's a story
like,
as
what's
old
the
as
big,
the city
what's
of
the big
angels.
deal? This is super simple. But I'm trying to represent that this wasn't something made. This wasn't some flippant decision. This wasn't like, I want to be cool and accepted in modern culture, so I'm going to shed all this stuff.
The reason why it hurts is because
It's a dismissal.
that assumption is a dismissal. It's an assumption of your true motives that you don't want to state, which are, hey, you just want to sow your wild oats, and you want to be cool, or you want to You want to be able to face your friends who believe different things or like they have different lifestyles. And in order to be successful out there, you got to make some changes, okay? I mean,
it's this idea that other people think that you are willing to sacrifice eternal life for this life right now.
Watch any award show now and see how the entertainment industry is pushing change in perspectives and changes in the way people act, if not believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, hey, if I get it, if you guys want to go out there and you want to pursue your dreams, and if that's really what's most important to you, then yeah, you got to give up your beliefs. You got to make a choice. And it seems like that's the easy thing. You guys made the choice. And it's like no one's said that out loud to us, but
I've seen people say it.
They've typed it maybe.
I've seen it typed. I saw it typed after our first 2 episodes. Somebody was like, what's the big deal? It's clear what happened. They went to Los Angeles and they lost their faith. It happens. And I'm just trying to, first of all, hopefully, if you've listened to this point, you at least acknowledge that this was a process that was in many ways independent of where I was at, but also way more personal and torturous, and it wasn't a calculated business decision.
There's something deeply dismissive about that. And I think it's easier to do to a public figure than it is to someone in your life when you don't know someone's actual story and how deep their faith was and how hard this journey was. I think it's really easy to look at it and say, like they mentioned at the beginning, oh, they never really believed. They never really had that deep of conviction if they moved and it's just gone. And clearly it's so much more than that. But there has to be a way for those with this belief to explain away all of the very valid points being raised here.
It wasn't like, I don't know, that particular accusation hurts a lot. When people say you were never a Christian and when people say you changed because of LA, those things hurt a lot because of how untrue I know them to be.
So there's an aspect, and I will get into more of this.
Okay.
So I think we'll come back to it, but your point for now is that there was an aspect of you changing because of LA.
Yeah, and this is where LA comes into play. LA did allow me to ask a new question.
Impact things, but it's not
and that
everything.
Was, why am I still doing this? And I'll be honest, I would not have asked that question if I was in North Carolina, because when you're in the Bible Belt, you're embedded in Christian culture, there are dozens of reasons why you would still be doing it. I mean, why rock the boat? Why disappoint your parents? Why disappoint your friends? Why get yourself out of this community that you have? I had been going to the same church since I was in 9th grade.
I would say technically your whole life, because that church came from another church that we both went to our whole life.
Exactly. I've been with the same group of believers forever. And now I was leading a Bible study. I had preached sermons on Sunday. You know what I'm saying? There's all kinds of reasons not to leave. Why damage your reputation? Because honestly, in the Bible Belt, this can be, as many people know, if you've left the faith in the Bible Belt, it ain't easy. There's a lot of pressure to stick around and stay in there. But what I realize is that I've been pulling on this thread for a really long time, right? Let's call it the sweater of faith, which is not...
Okay, again, I know that I have seen this video before, but it has been years. And the fact that I literally talked about unraveling the sweater earlier, and I also talked about the Bible Belt, and there was another one earlier that I said right before it happened. I just feel like I'm so in sync with this right now. Just had to mention.
The armor of God. This is a Rhett McLaughlin concept. The sweater of faith. I've been pulling on this thread, and it had sort of like turned into a vest, and then a midriff, and then a halter top, and now it was a string bikini.
That's not appropriate.
And I was like, I'm going to take the bikini off.
Really not appropriate.
It's just an analogy.
Okay.
And I was in LA.
Yeah.
Men in bikini tops, just There's lots of places you can
Go to
and
the
see
convenience
that.
store.
And I took it off, and I call
What do
this.
you mean? How did you take it off?
Well, I have a journal entry, thankfully.
Great. That's great. Okay. Give it to me.
It has nothing to do with bikinis.
I wish it did.
This is from 2014.
Kidding.
Okay. I understand that it is unreasonable to expect Christianity to be a set of scientifically verifiable principles. It is a faith, implying that some sort of believing without seeing is involved. And more specifically, Christianity is a relationship with Jesus, and relationships are not well defined or experienced scientifically. However, I don't think it insignificant that the deeper I have dug into Christianity with a thirst for the truth, the more difficult it has become to have faith. In fact, for me, it has become impossible. And that was kind of the reckoning for me, right? That was jumping ship, to use a better analogy than taking off a bikini. You see, I kind of saw Christianity as this boat in a very stormy sea. It's stable. There's a lot of other people on it. It's got a destination. You're going to get through this. It gives you something to hold on to. It gives you stability. It gives you purpose. It gives you direction. And it gives you community. And
when you leave that direction, you have to take on all of these things for yourself. You have to build your own community. You have to give yourself purpose. You have to make your own meaning. It is like truly the existentialist's project, right? There is no answer except the one that you can create. And that's terrifying. And that's why I think hearing the dismissal of, oh, it's because you went to LA. Oh, you were never really a Christian, is so hard and so hurtful, is because that dismissal is almost like you made the coward's choice by leaving your faith. It would have been braver to stay. The truth is, it is the coward's choice to perform faith. That is cowardly. True courage is looking the fear of being unfounded, ungrounded, untethered in the face and stepping forward anyways. That's faith in yourself. That is strength.
when I jumped ship, I didn't jump to another boat. I jumped into the water. And I pulled my wife and my children in with me. I jumped into a sea of uncertainty. And that's where I've lived for about 6 years. And we're going to spend some time talking a little bit more about where we're at now. I do want to talk about it now, but we'll get in more detail in like a subsequent podcast, maybe in a Q&A or something. But I want to kind of talk about what this has been like without getting into too much detail. And I know because we're already pretty long. This is going to be a long one. Right after I jumped ship, I kind of went through a period of anger. I was very mad at the Christian leaders and thinkers who I felt deceived by. I want to be very clear about this. No one that I was in personal contact with, pastors, Christian friends, elders in my church, none of them disappointed me or let me down. I did not have a personal tragedy. A lot of people have a traumatic spiritual experience in a church. I didn't. I only got good things from the church. We talked about this a while back that listen, I'm a straight white dude. You get a lot of things handed to you, especially within the church.
This kind of goes back to what I was saying about the woman's experience in the church. I didn't have anything standout traumatic. I think that there's capital T trauma and lower T trauma. I'd say I probably have lower T religious trauma. I don't have a capital T trauma though. Nothing like that has ever happened. And so there is this weird guilt built in to that experience too. That's so many other people have so much more. I also want to mention something I mentioned earlier about being actively deceived by people who, are using the religion to manipulate versus people who believe what they're saying. I do think in this experience that Rhett is saying is that these people believe what they were telling him. They're not actively trying to deceive him. And I think 9 times out of 10, that is the case. I think it's also important to stay aware of how people can use religion to intentionally manipulate. And I do believe that's happening on a really big scale right now.
You fit that profile. In some churches, being a straight dude is the only way that you can teach. There's plenty of churches right now, churches in Los Angeles, that people would consider progressive, where you better not tell them you're gay. And if you're a woman, you probably won't be able to preach. It's 2020, and this is still the case. Just want to be clear about that. But for me, I got so much out of this. I was riding high. I could have ridden this train to the top, man. You know what I'm saying? And nobody disappointed me personally, but I was angry at the thinkers. I was angry at the people who had written the book saying that evolution didn't have any evidence. I was angry at the people who had written systematic theology books who basically made it seem like this was all pretty simple. And the pendulum swung for a time into atheism. I was like, this is all bullshit, and I'm going to be the enemy of this stuff.
The atheism backslide. I did not experience this personally. It is so common. And I think the anger that people have is what fuels a lot of this. And anger for me is something that is really difficult to tap into even now. First time I ever felt angry, I was 20 years old, and that was after I had kind of gone through a lot of this, right? And this was kind of like dabbling in like agnostic, atheist, theist, field kind of time for me. And I just felt all this anger for this internalized self-hatred that I kind of had from the church, like I was talking about earlier. But I think a big reason why I didn't have that atheist backslide, and it's not really a backslide. I say backslide because it kind of sounds funny, but I hope you understand what I mean when I say that, is because I wasn't tapped into anger. And I think that that's actually a really healthy response, is to look at how you've been lied to and misled and mistreated and be pissed. You should be pissed. Righteous indignation is a sacred emotion. That is how movements start. That's how we get Me Too. That's how we get Time's Up. That's how we get Martin Luther King Jr. That's how we get any number of important activism is from anger. And I didn't feel it. And so instead I kind of had this weird snowball-y kind of effect, but also in this way that I wasn't really Christian and then asked that question if that wasn't true. It was more reconstruction as deconstructing, right? And so it was like, okay, yes, we're leaving Christianity, but there is something else here to kind of explore. Even in that exploration, I will say I did still feel that kind of lost at sea feeling a little bit, but different than what Rhett is describing, because I think his level of commitment and devotion is very different than mine was. Obviously, having built your entire life on something versus being a teenager when this happens, radically different. I feel like I did have a few buoys to kind of swim back and forth between, right, and explore in his analogy. But I wasn't angry until I was. And then I really was. And I still am sometimes. And other times I'm grateful for it. And sometimes I'm both.
I'm going to be an anti-evangelist. That's what I was thinking at the time. Of course, we're still very private about all this, so it wasn't like I said this to anybody publicly. And that anger actually subsided rather quickly. It's interesting. I kind of had my moment of anger in atheism. And then that was replaced with kind of an openness and a curiosity. You know, it's interesting. how liberating this one aspect has been. I think the biggest change that has happened to me in my life is that I've lost my appetite for certainty, specifically certainty about things I don't think you can be certain about. I think Christianity, my struggle with Christianity, for me, a big part of it was I had to keep aligning my thoughts and being certain and kind of redriving my faith and why this was reasonable and being sure about this and knowing exactly what was going to happen when I die and all this stuff. But when I was like, I don't think I can be certain about these things. It's like when a person, I've heard this happens, I haven't done it yet. When you stop eating meat, you lose your appetite for meat, a lot of people say. I stopped being certain about things. I lost my appetite to be certain. I didn't wake up with a sense of panic. I thought there would be panic. I thought there would be chaos.
Especially for someone who that's how you lived your life.
And I thought there would be fear.
You were so attached to it.
Right. But it's been the most liberating thing that has happened in my adult life. I'm not kidding.
It's so powerful.
I'm not trying to paint that. Listen, it's not like I'm about to give you some philosophy that I live according to now that gives me community purpose and meaning. I don't have that, okay? I think there's a giant sort of shift that's happening culturally, and I think that we may be arriving at that sometime, but it doesn't exist right now for me. But what does exist is an openness, is this curiosity. Listen, I still think that belief in God is very reasonable. I think that the idea that the universe is...
I think that curiosity is so important, and I do just want to throw in here that this idea of a community, of a structure, of a worldview that brings you community, purpose, and meaning. That's what I'm trying to create with the Cohere Collective. We should all have that and be able to have that with each other, regardless of worldview. We all exist in community with one another, whether we like it or not. We all have purpose, whether we like it or not. We all have meaning, whether we like it or not. If you don't make it for yourself, someone else will make it or choose it or tell you, for you, to you. Let's do it intentionally, with attention and intention. Not only do your neighbors deserve that from you, do we deserve that from each other, but you deserve that for yourself. Can you imagine if we let go of the pressure of all of these things that we have to abide within, these rules and silos that society has set up for us, and oftentimes we have set up for ourselves, and just existed within our own truth, with one another. I hope I see a day where I don't have to imagine it and I can just witness it. I will see a day where I don't have to imagine it and we can all witness it. Cue Imagine by John Lennon.
It's ultimately purposeful. It's headed towards some ultimate purpose. Not only is that comforting, but it kind of feels, again, it feels right to me when I just look at the history of the world and where, but I don't know it to be certain. And I don't know anything about this source or this God that might be behind all this. And I'm kind of beginning to think that I don't know if you are supposed to know a whole lot about it. So I would call myself a hopeful agnostic, meaning I don't know, but I hope. I hope there's something. And a question that I've gotten from some people who are close to me and love me is, what do you think happens after you die? I don't know. I'm reasonably certain that you don't burn in hell because you were intellectually curious and honest, to put it bluntly.
Fair.
But honestly, I'm more interested now in what happens while I live. It's not so much what happens after you die, but what happens while you're alive. And I'm trying to answer that question, but it's one of the reasons I'm in therapy. It's honestly one of the reasons that I get up every morning and do 20 minutes of back exercises, honestly.
And let me say this, as someone who has been in therapy since I was 12, a year less than how long I've been watching Rhett and Link. That's a wild thing to say. But yes, I've been in therapy since I was 12 years old with the same therapist every Tuesday, like clockwork, literally. I do think that that is a big reason why this de-reconstruction was able to happen at the time that it did for me in the way that it did, and while I was processing through the actual things that I was experiencing in real time, because I was able to talk to a therapist about it. Someone outside of myself who had no skin in the game with where I ended up with my religion. Not doesn't care what happens, because they do care. They're human beings, and you're a human being. Your therapist, of course, cares what happens to you and has their own opinions, but there's not a vested interest in you being a Christian. So I'm really lucky to have had that. And I just want to credit that, and I want to acknowledge my parents in that. My mom is a licensed counselor, a licensed therapist, and so obviously this kind of work is normal in my family, and so I'm really grateful to have had that and to have had her and my dad's support in being in therapy forever. I'm also grateful to have found the therapist that I did that was the right fit. Yeah, so I want to acknowledge all of that and the piece that it played in this process for me.
It's one of the reasons that I think more about what I eat. Because the only thing I know that I've got is this life, you know? But the other thing that has kind of happened, because people ask me about, you know, your marriage, your kids, we'll get into this in more detail. But Jessie has her own story. There's been a lot of crying.
Me.
But she's in a similar place now. And this process, because we were so, no, this whole process ruins a lot of marriages. I've seen it a lot. Because sometimes people are like, I can't go there. Not going there. It's over. This was the whole foundation. I mean, yeah, we made vows. If you read, we wrote our own vows for our wedding, and they were very much about Jesus. But now it's kind of like our marriage has hit a second wind, where
so beautiful.
It's not so much about a structure that we both sort of assent to that tells us what our marriage should be like. But it's like, hey, it's pretty cool that I get to go through life with you. I love you.
Isn't that what you want in a partner? Like, wow, I just think that that's epic. What a partnership.
A pretty good thing to concentrate on. And with the kids, you know, I think for me, the idea that purpose and meaning and sort of like orienting your life in a certain way all came from the Bible and from church. I actually, because none of that went away. You know what I'm saying? Like I still want to be the same kind of person that I've always wanted to be. I want to be the same kind of husband. I want the best for my kids.
Meaning like your morality.
Yeah.
Is still like you.
Yeah.
You don't. The moment that you jumped ship, you didn't start looking to cheat on your wife.
Right.
So, as an example.
I think that this is so interesting. There, of course, within atheist-theist debates, there's always this, you have nothing to ground morality. If you're an atheist, it all goes back to preference, right? And it's like, okay, why can't I base a morality on preference? Your preference is just that it's a God that you feel more comfortable with assigning morality to because it's external to self and something about that feels more just. But my preference is that I'm treated the way other people want to be treated, and therefore I'll do the same to them. Yeah, it's a preference, but that doesn't mean it's not moral.
Exactly. It wasn't like all of a sudden, and I'd always been told that. And I had many Christians who I respected say, man, if God wasn't real, I would be out doing drugs right now, or I'd be out sleeping with whoever I want. I'm like, I don't actually think you would. I think you actually have an innate desire to be a pretty good person and to live a life that is good for you and the people you love.
And if you do want to go do drugs,
attach it to a structure and an explanation like Christianity. But I think very few people actually.
not to want to do drugs, but to be like, if this one thing, like this faith that you have chosen to believe in isn't there, you would do something differently. It's like you can do something differently at any time. And I get that it's more complex than that because of the strength of that belief and devotion and all of the other things that we've kind of talked about. But one, I don't think it's true that you would go do drugs. But two, if you were that type of person, that would be odd. That you would just completely 180 change the way you live your life. Because I don't think you would actually believe in a religion that didn't line up to the intuitive way that you already want to live your life.
Find the purpose in their faith. I think they have purpose and then they bolster it with faith. That's my personal opinion.
Or even another way to put it, using the marriage example. Do you think that your motive to be true to Jesse was not just out of love for her, but out of love for God, out of respect for, so now you being true to Jesse is out of love for her. It's aligned. And
it's not a fear of God. It's a love for her, and it's a fear of, listen, there's a lot of shit that happens when you do stuff like that in your life. There are natural built-in consequences to doing the things that are traditionally considered to be sinful, according to every religious tradition. It's not like if I didn't have this, I'd be out doing all kinds of crazy shit. No, you wouldn't. It's like, first of all, my best friends now are not Christians, but they're faithful to their families. And
this is kind of making me think about the atheist argument that religion is evolutionarily beneficial, and that's why it has evolved, because there's something about the community, purpose, meaning, these things that Rhett continues to refer back to, that has made it stay and prosper and is such a foundational part of life. And that it's there's this weird flip to it that's okay, but you take religion away, there is still evolutionary benefits to things that we consider to be moral or immoral. Morality and a shared definition around those things is beneficial. Why do we add God into that? That still feels like Occam's razor to me. I do think that the piece of faith that I still have wants to argue against the idea that religion is just evolutionarily beneficial. Because why would you have a God to ground these things when you could have these things that are already beneficial without an omniscient being that you also have to believe in? And I do believe that there is something in addition to that that makes humans invent a God. I just don't know what it is. But there is something there. I don't think religion in and of itself is evolutionarily beneficial. I think the things it provides are. But why have God then?
They're not horrible people.
They're not horrible people.
And I think that's what we thought was without the Holy Spirit indwelling you, you're just going off the flesh, so to speak. You're going off of your own desires, and that's the only thing keeping you from being a horrible person. I think that's from a young age. I think that's what we felt. But I think the thing
that's a particular view of people that we had in our particular Reformed, Calvinistic. Mm-hmm. Everyone is totally depraved, and anything good that is coming from anybody is either because they're created in the image of God or they have a relationship with God.
I think too. I want to get back to that being a subsection and everything that you've talked about, being applied to the whole of Christianity or faith or anything like that. But before that, you were moving to the kids from your relationship with Jesse. I kind of went back to the relationship with Jesse. So when you were talking about the kids, you were talking about raising them in a way to be whole people, to be good people. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you were getting it.
Well, I think the biggest thing about kids is what I have sort of observed in being very much embedded in the church for a very long time, is there's kind of this idea that it is your responsibility as parents to make sure your kids turn out all right. And that it's up to you. You better teach them the right thing. If you don't, they're going to be screwed up. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't teach your kids good things. But what I've observed is that, you know what, my kids actually teach me a lot. I think that kids orient themselves in the world much more readily based on your behavior than the specific things that you tell them.
Real.
I don't think that having an
Also,
information session with your kids,
everything being on you,
indoctrinating them, is what's going to make them into a good person. I'm not saying we're not constantly talking about issues of morality and ethical things, philosophical things. And we talk about that at every time. Our family is like very much always talking about these things. But the interesting and sort of freeing thing is that when my kids have a question about God or the deeper purpose of the universe or what happens when you die, we explore those things as people. I'm not here as some authority that's going to point you to this ironclad thing and that's going to make it okay, because you know what?
And I actually think that creates a lot of safety for your kids. I think that there is this fear that, well, if I don't have all the answers, that's going to be like ungrounding for my family, for my kids. As a child who has witnessed my parents pretend to have answers and have answers and not have answers and own it, the thing that has given me the most comfort is my parents saying, I really don't know, but let's talk about it. Not only does it make you feel like you're not alone in feeling that way, but you're also not alone in the journey. And there's no pressure of having to have the answer, of having to have it figured out, or of having to agree with something. The honesty creates safety.
But it's not going to make it okay. Just because I can point to this book and tell you that you should believe this, I am proof that believing those things isn't necessarily going to make all those deeper thoughts go away. And so in getting my kids comfortable with sort of living in tension and being okay with not having all that stuff figured out. But it's like, well, what can you have figured out? And what does lead to a fruitful, meaningful life? Well, you know what? A life devoted to others. A life devoted to yourself is going to fail. I don't feel like I have to explain the dynamics behind that for it to be true. But
you do explain it. Sometimes you talk about being
an interesting one, because I do think there's some innate tension in that as well, that to be devoted to others, you must first be devoted to yourself, and that they're actually not mutually exclusive, that they necessitate one another. I'm considering, do I believe that that's true? Yeah. I think being devoted to the self and to the other necessitates one another.
Parent, as if like you are who you're going to be, and I know that's not what you're saying, but I think what you just said is clarifying that you're teaching.
Well, I am saying that to an extent.
I know you are. And
I am saying that to an extent.
We have a little bit of a different
approach,
but
I would say
fine,
that the latest child psychology basically suggests that kids are they're going to be a certain way. But
you're talking about selfishness versus self-sacrifice. You're talking about what it means to love. You're talking about what type of person do you want to be?
Yeah, and also the thing I try to get my kids to do is process the consequences of their actions. It's just like, hey, Shepherd, I just asked you if you had Mom's phone, and you told me no, but you do have Mom's phone. Let's talk about why you did that, and let's talk about what it means to be a person who's willing to lie who's willing to say something that's false about this. And so it's like, what is going to happen if you become a person who can't be trusted? What's that going to do? What kind of life are you going to live as a person who can't be trusted? And for me, that just is that tangible, like nitty gritty, getting down to the details of like, what does this mean? What are the ramifications of your behavior?
I think that approach also separates good action and bad action from good person, bad person, which is also really important for building a healthy sense of identity and self-worth. That just because you do something bad doesn't mean you are bad, or that you do something good and that means you are good. Where does that lead us? I think that that's really interesting, and it also invites the child into the conversation with you, as opposed to the don't do that. Wrong, bad, punish.
For me, and listen, I know that I've read all the Ravi Zacharias books and I've seen him speak. I know that the whole idea is, well, where does the morality come from if it's not coming from a moral lawgiver, God himself? I think that argument is marginally compelling, but I don't think that is conclusive. And I think the point is I don't think you wake up and make decisions to be a good person because you've got this moral lawgiver. There may be a moral lawgiver. I'm not saying that God doesn't exist, but I think that it's a much more natural and organic process than there's a book, I read it, and now I know what to do. I think that's why those core qualities of what makes a human good exist in cultures.
Every time someone makes a decision, they're not sitting down and thinking,
the Amazon that's
literally,
never been exposed to the
WWJD.
gospel or any sort of religious system outside of what they believe. Are they going to think that murdering is great? Probably not. They didn't need Hammurabi or Moses to tell them that. So,
But I guess I'll move on to one other thing.
whatever his name is, I don't think that's how you say his name.
Hammurabi's code. I don't know how you say his name. I know you talked about anger, and you also talked about how there wasn't an inciting incident outside of your own intellectual exercise and research. But do you find that there's baggage, that there's things that you need, things that you need to heal from?
Because of who I am and what I look like, I pretty much just benefited. And so I don't look back at my experience with the church in a traumatic way. I just feel like, oh man, I was very lucky. And we talked about it last week. Professionally, I got a lot out of it. I was able to develop professionally and live my dream out. For me, most of my therapy is related to, just sort of the realization that everyone's personality is essentially constructed over their child, their inner child. And it's a way of sort of navigating and moving through the world. It's a protective shell. And so for me, it's like, why is that your shell? And what is that child underneath saying, feeling?
Do you feel
so it's more early childhood stuff, and it's not trauma. It's just figuring out.
But do you feel like everything that you, having constructed that shell, that the belief system that you had became a part of that, became another layer?
I kind of agree with what Link's getting at a little bit here. I think maybe he's seeking to see if some of his understanding of that is similar for Rhett, or maybe I think it is just genuine curiosity too. But there is something about, like, even if you didn't experience direct trauma because of this thing, just the beliefs that were ingrained in you did kind of create some of that little t trauma, right? And I think that that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when I said I had a lot of anger about these things that I experienced. And it's not necessarily because anything horrific happened to me. It was just because of the words that I was told over and over and over and over and over again. And those echo. And you see those echoes in my shell, to use Rhett's language, which I think is really beautiful. his language, not the experience of echoing hurt. Which I suppose in a sublime way is beautiful too, but besides the point.
I haven't processed it, but definitely yes. I haven't gotten to any of this in my therapy yet.
Again, it's like the thing that you're talking, your whole story is so much in your head, it's like when you talk about,
I love how he says I haven't gotten to any of this in my therapy yet, because it makes me assume, which is incorrect to do, I shouldn't, but it kind of sounds like he's going through chronologically through his life, which is just such a Rhett way to approach therapy. She says as though she knows him personally. Seems like a very Rhett kind of structured, oriented way to approach therapy. And I very much how I kind of originally did too, Virgo, until my therapist was like, we can just jump around. We don't need to go step by step. And I was like, oh, what if we forget something? And she's like, you won't forget the important stuff. It'll come up.
Yeah.
You'd being devastated in like those moments of there's being a crack in the dam, and then when you decide to jump ship, like you allude to it being a torturous time. You said that there is moments of like it being really
He's
scary.
such an active listener.
But it does seem like the story is very much in your head.
Yeah. And
maybe there's stuff under there.
And I understand that that's one of the things that a lot of people won't relate to what I'm saying, because they're like, why is this? There's Christians that I know and love who, when I tell them this story, I just kind of see them just look off and quit listening. Because it's just like, why is he spending all this time talking about the second chromosome?
Right.
Like, why is that important to him? And what does that have to do with God?
Yeah.
And for me, it has everything to do with my story.
It does.
Because it's all related, Again, the whole idea is that the foundation is truth. And so, but in terms of,
it is about the foundation.
I feel like my attempt
cracks.
to like focus on the relationship and focus on faith was my attempt to get out of my own head and get into my heart when it came to my perspective on God, and to lean into the relationship. But again, it's that inextricable relationship between facts and feelings. It's still, you can have an incredible experience with somebody relationally, and it can feel completely emotional and physical, but yet there is sort of a scientific representation, a naturalist understanding of what's happening between the two of you. And I think that
maybe not naturalist,
there's this foundation that I kept coming back to, and every time I came back to it, and the interesting thing is, it isn't like the Christian apologists are saying that they don't make the argument that I was trying to make in my head. They don't say, don't worry about this, just have faith. They say, because they know they have to, no, this is defensible. Here's why. Here's why evolution didn't happen. And here's why you can trust, and I can even prove to you. I know a guy who wrote a term paper in college on why the resurrection is an undeniable historical fact.
That's not true.
Those things being true are sort of what the founding fathers of the faith.
But it goes back to whether you buy it or not, right?
No, especially those guys in the early church who were like figuring out how to think about all this stuff. They were doing intellectual work. It wasn't just happening in the heart. They were laying a philosophical framework that we've built our faith on. And I think that we've got more access to information about that process than we've ever had. And it deserves some scrutiny. And I actually think it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but that's where I'm at. I've seen that you've engaged a little bit with people on Twitter, and for some reason I just haven't had the emotional energy. I've been thinking a lot about this story. Yeah. I think I will engage with people if they have questions. I think we will engage with people if they have questions. And after you tell your story, which I'm excited to hear your story, because you're so different than me. Yeah. And I think that there's
for this time.
They also experienced it with each other. But to hear the way someone frames something that you were right there for is so interesting. I remember interviewing my dad for my podcast, Faking Meaning, and he said, I'm the middle of 3 children. It was so odd to hear him say that as a way to describe himself publicly. I've just never thought of my dad in that way, right? He has my aunt who's his little sister, but that's it. And it's like, just the way someone frames something to the public eye is really fascinating.
Type of stuff in this experience.
And I think,
but it's very much intertwined. And I think it's, we made a decision for you to go first, and I think that's very helpful for me, for people to understand my story second.
yeah.
But go ahead.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know how. I'm definitely, because I want everybody to like me, which is a flaw. It's not something I'm proud of. I know that some people won't like this. A lot of people won't like this. A lot of people are going to be offended. A lot of people are going to say that I misrepresented the facts. A lot of people are going to say, because listen, if you agree with everything I said, then how could you still have faith? So it's like, I understand that. Listen, I remember we had a good friend. We had a good friend who had a bunch of doubts, and I remember how we treated him, and I loved him. But I remember when he started talking all this stuff about how he was doubting certain things, I remember asking him, I was like, what are you going to teach your kids, man?
I do. I remember that.
And I remember thinking things like, man, I guess he never knew Jesus, because the Jesus I know, I would never think those things. And I know how I would have processed hearing this story. And it's just,
as a side note,
it's difficult for me.
I'm glad that we still have a relationship with him, and that we've talked through it since then, and that
how healing for everyone.
He was patient with us in a way that now you're asking for people to be patient with you, and I'm asking for people to be patient with me.
Yeah.
Patient, not in waiting for someone to change their mind, but just to still be loving. He was still very loving to us, even though it had to have been written all over everything we said and our faces,
Yeah, for sure. We should wrap things up.
Okay, so I think my last, in a desire to put a bow on something, are you happy with the label that you've given yourself of hopeful agnostic? I mean, is that, are you happy with that?
I don't know how to answer. I'm happy with it.
I mean,
it's just where I'm at. I am happy. I am happy.
Is it a destination? I guess is.
For me, I am open to revelation.
Can anything like this be a destination?
Like, I haven't. It's like, listen, there's some things.
Should I step back?
There's some things that I don't think I'll ever believe again. Like, I'm not ever gonna believe that the Earth is 10,000 years old. Like, that car left the garage a long time ago. I don't think I can have a worldview that doesn't embrace the reality of evolution, that every living being on the earth is related to every living being on the earth. And I actually think that's beautiful, even from the perspective of there might be a creator.
Agree.
And I know that I could go into the desert, or I could go into the office and have a crazy religious experience that all of a sudden I come back and I'm like, I got something for you. And I'm not closing myself off to that. I'm not some pure naturalist. Because listen, if my story represents
I need to look at the
anything,
definition
is that
between
I'm willing to
naturalist
change
and
my mind.
materialist.
I had a faith that was so solid. This was so deep. This wasn't this Sunday morning thing, man. This was a lifestyle. This was in my blood. And I let it go because I did not believe it to be true. I'm going to follow truth wherever it leads, without fear of uncomfortable conclusions.
And if that means that, oh, and you know what? You're going to have an encounter with God that is going to send you to some new place or send you all the way back, then so be it. But the thing I don't want to do is I feel like the curiosity and the openness that characterizes my life right now is something I don't want to let go of. And I don't want to be
Heard.
Quote
Heard,
from Ravi
chef.
Zacharias that I used to say, I'm going to butcher the quote, but he essentially talked about, you don't want to be so open-minded that your mind is like a sewer, just letting everything in. Eventually you got to bite down on something. So I recognize that you just can't be passive, but actually, I don't know.
Curiosity
I have had some experiences.
can be really
and
active.
Come to some conclusions, but
Should
I'm not
be.
ready to share all that at this point. But I would say that if anything, it's just sort of confirmed the direction that I've been going, kind of away from the faith of my childhood. That's my story.
Thank you for sharing.
I do have Rex.
Make a wreck, then tell me it feels good to get it out.
First of all, it does feel good to tell this story. You have to wait a little bit. Yeah.
Lovely.
I'm going to sleep well tonight, Link. I didn't sleep well last night. I've already mentioned a couple of these wrecks, but I'm going to say it again because they relate to what I just told you about. Again, the wiki entry on chromosome 2. Read it. It's a short one. It's super easy to understand. It's a better explanation of what I just said. The wiki entry entitled Evidence of Common Descent, which is a long one. Again, the people might be like, why are you pointing people to Wikipedia? Well, Wikipedia is actually a great reference for these kinds of things because it's all footnoted and referenced, and you can go to those resources if you want to dig deeper. But it's a great, comprehensive, up-to-date list, sort of a living list of the evidence for evolution. But if you are a book person, whether you want to read or listen to it, I do recommend Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne, which is a pretty sort of easy-to-read explanation if you've never kind of dug into the subject.
Hashtag ear biscuits. Wow. Wow. Well, I really enjoyed that. This was a hoot and a half to sit and listen and return to this episode that impacted me so much. Again, thank you to Rhett and Link. I'll specifically thank Rhett for his vulnerability and honesty in this episode, and Link for his thoughtful listening and questions. I think that witnessing their friendship is a big part of what Mythical is. I mean, they even say it, we're selling the friendship, right? But to me, it's the authenticity of that realness that has always sold me on who they are. I know that I talked a little bit about my journey and I didn't really get to where I am now. And again, I think I want to save it. No spoils. I have a feeling that Link's episode, when I react to it, will dive into even more of some of my history and background and experiences with deconstruction and reconstruction. And at the end of that episode, I'll give a little bit of a spiel about where I'm at now and the evolution that I'm kind of going through as I live. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. Is this something that you enjoyed, that you would like to see continued? I know it's long, but I think that's kind of fun. Thank you very much for being here. Please subscribe to the Cohere Collective and give us a like, comment down below, all of the things. Check out Making Meaning and Bow Down and Our Daily Ritual. And if you have further questions, head on over to thecoherecollective.com. You can schedule an appointment with me there for a free 15-minute consultation for coherent design, which is all about living your life with purpose. And follow us at the Cohere Collective on any social media you have. And I'll catch you all on the flippity flip. And I hope you feel like you are living more coherently. Until next time, love.